Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. It is time now to let go of the effort of looking. The eyes have been busy all day, tracking movement and reading the world. But here in the quiet, that constant attention can finally soften. The weight of being available to every passing detail and the strain of processing the immediate world can now be set aside, allowing the mind to settle into the steady rhythm of a longer, deeper time. If these chronicles help you find rest, please like this video and subscribe so we can continue to walk these paths together. We share a new journey every week, and your presence in this quiet community is truly valued. The story of Jerusalem is a narrative of stone and spirit, chronicling a city built layer by layer upon a singular limestone ridge. It is a history of the rising and setting of empires, and the patient endurance of a sanctuary that has watched over the Judean hills for thousands of years. Let the current hour recede, and let your awareness drift toward the cool, ancient silence of the Judean bedrock. Chapter 1. The Ridge and the Spring. High upon the limestone spine of the Judean hills, where the wind carries the faint scent of wild thyme and sun-baked earth, a narrow finger of rock once rose in solitary prominence. This ridge, later known as the Ophel, sat bounded by deep, sheltering ravines that offered a natural seclusion from the broader world. To the east, the Kidron Valley dropped away with a sudden, steep gravity, while to the west and south, the Tyropaean and Hinnom valleys carved deep grooves into the landscape. These natural barriers created a high, triangular plateau that remained remarkably defensible, a stony island in a sea of rolling hills. It was a place of stark, pale beauty, where the white Judean limestone held the heat of the day long after the sun had dipped behind the western peaks. The Gihon Spring provided the singular reason for human persistence on this otherwise arid height. Beneath the eastern slope of the ridge, tucked within a natural cave, the water bubbled forth with a rhythmic, pulsing irregularity that the ancients found both mysterious and vital. This spring was not a steady stream, but a hidden reservoir that surged several times a day, filling the limestone basins with a cool, clear liquid that tasted faintly of the deep earth. For the early inhabitants, the water was a sacred gift, a pulse of life that allowed a small community to flourish where others might have withered. The sound of the Gihon, a soft and persistent splashing against the cave walls, became the heartbeat of the early settlement, a constant reminder of the city's reliance on the hidden depths. Long before the arrival of kings or the building of great walls, the Jebusites recognized the strategic value of this rocky finger above the spring. They were a Canaanite people who understood the logic of the land, and they set about turning the natural ridge into a fortified stronghold. They did not merely inhabit the rock, they reshaped it to suit their needs, carving cisterns and storage pits directly into the limestone. Their dwellings were modest, built of unhewn stone and mud brick, but they were positioned with an eye for surveillance and defense. The city they called Jebus was a tight, compact maze of narrow alleys and sturdy foundations, a place where the community lived in a state of watchful equilibrium with the surrounding hills. To secure the height of their citadel, the Jebusite masons undertook a monumental engineering task that resulted in what remains today as the stepped stone structure. This massive mantle of stone and earth was built to support a grand building or fortress on the crest of the hill, preventing the steep slope from eroding beneath the weight of the masonry. One can almost see the laborers of that distant era as they hauled heavy blocks of limestone up the hillside, fitting them together without mortar to create a series of stabilizing terraces. Each stone was chosen for its weight and shape, laid with a deliberate patience that has allowed the structure to endure for thousands of years. It was a triumph of early engineering, a testament to the Jebusite desire to anchor themselves permanently to the ridge, creating a solid base for the halls of their rulers. David, having united the tribes of the north and south, looked upon this neutral Jebusite stronghold with the eye of a strategist seeking a center. The city sat on the border between the territories of Benjamin and Judah, belonging to neither, and thus offering a unique opportunity for a capital that might unify a fractured people. He arrived before the walls with a seasoned army, yet the Jebusites remained confident in their defenses, famously taunting the king from the heights. They believed their position was so secure that even the blind and the lame could hold the gates against an invader. The ridge, with its steep approaches and formidable walls, seemed to justify their arrogance, standing as a silent challenge to the new monarchy. Because the gates were impenetrable, the conquest of the city followed the path of the water rather than the path of the sword. Joab, David's commander, is recorded as having discovered a way into the citadel through a vertical shaft or sinner that connected the spring below to the city above. In the quiet hours of the night, while the Jebusite sentries watched the slopes, a small party of men moved through the damp, dark passage of the water system. They climbed through the narrow openings, their hands finding grip on the slick, cold limestone, until they emerged within the walls of the fortress. The capture of Jebus was a quiet affair of strategic infiltration, a shift of power that happened from within the very earth the city was built upon. One might observe that the history of Jerusalem is often a history of what lies beneath the surface as much as what stands upon it. By choosing this city, David was not merely selecting a fortress, he was adopting a landscape that required constant, intimate labor to sustain. The transition from the Jebusite Jebus to the city of David was marked by a slow expansion of the existing structures as the new administration integrated itself into the old stone. The king's palace was built using cedar logs sent by Hiram of Tyre, a material whose fragrant, resinous scent must have seemed exotic against the local smell of dust and wool. This early cooperation with the Phoenicians signaled the beginning of the city's transition from a local stronghold to a regional center of trade and diplomacy. Inside the new capital, the pace of life settled into the rhythms of a royal court and an administrative hub. The Gihon water, once carried in simple jars, was now directed through more complex channels to feed the growing population and the king's gardens. To drink from the spring in those days was to taste a sharp, mineral coldness that refreshed the throat after the dry heat of the Judean afternoon. The human-scale reality of the city was one of constant masonry, as the millo, a term likely referring to the filling of slopes with earth and stone, was expanded to create more level ground for houses. The sound of iron tools chipping away at the limestone became a permanent feature of the city's atmosphere, a rhythmic clink that echoed across the Kidron Valley. Time moved with a patient wait during these formative years of the Davidic dynasty. The city was not yet a place of grand temples, but it was already a place of deep significance, housing the Ark of the Covenant in a modest tent upon the ridge. This presence turned the stony plateau into a destination, drawing pilgrims and petitioners from the surrounding countryside. They brought with them the sounds of different dialects and the dust of many roads, mingling in the narrow streets that David had expanded. The ridge was becoming a crossroads, a point where the nomadic traditions of the past met the settled, bureaucratic requirements of a rising kingdom. Northward from the city of David lay a higher elevation, a broad limestone platform that was then used as a threshing floor. This space, owned by a Jebusite named Araunah, was a place where the wind could easily catch the chaff as the grain was tossed into the air. It was a functional, agricultural site, yet David saw in its elevation and its separation from the crowded city below a potential for something more enduring. The purchase of this threshing floor for 50 shekels of silver was a quiet legal transaction that would define the city's topography for the next 3 millennia. It shifted the focus of the city upward toward the sky and the open air of the mountain peak. Purchasing the land was an act of preparation, a gesture toward a future that David himself would not fully see realized. He spent the latter years of his reign accumulating the materials necessary for a permanent house of worship, stores of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, along with vast quantities of timber and stone. The city became a giant storehouse, a repository for the wealth of a kingdom that was beginning to feel its own strength. Even as the king aged, his focus remained on the logistics of construction, organized with a meticulous attention to the provenance and quality of every beam and block. The atmosphere of the city in this era was one of anticipation, a sense that the current structures were merely a prelude to a grander architectural vision. It was during these sunset years of David's life that the city's administrative character truly took shape. The records of the kingdom were kept by scribes on scrolls of papyrus and parchment, their ink made from soot and gum, documenting the tithes and the labor levies required for the king's projects. The city was no longer just a collection of families. It was an institution, a machine of state that required constant maintenance and oversight. The elders sat in the gates, their voices low and steady as they settled disputes over land and livestock, their authority grounded in the laws that David had solidified. The limestone walls of the city watched over a society that was learning the complexities of order and the weight of history. As the reign of David drew to its inevitable close, the question of succession was settled with a quiet but firm transition to his son, Solomon. The coronation took place near the Gihon Spring, the very source of the city's life, where the sound of the trumpets mingled with the splashing of the water. This choice of location was a deliberate tethering of the new king to the city's most ancient and vital element. Solomon did not inherit a finished city, but rather a work in motion, a blueprint of stone and ambition that had been laid by his father. The atmosphere was one of continuity, a passing of the torch in the dim light of the Kidron Valley as the sun set on one era and rose on another. Eventually, the aging David was gathered to his ancestors, and he was buried within the city he had captured and transformed. His tomb, carved into the very rock of the ridge, became a silent anchor for the dynasty, a place where the memory of the founder remained woven into the geography of the capital. The legacy he left behind was not just a kingdom, but a specific orientation of stone and spirit, centered on the ridge above the spring. The city of Jebus was gone, replaced by a capital that was beginning to look beyond its own walls toward the wider world of empires and trade. The legacy of this first era was the stabilization of the rock itself, the preparation of the mountain for the grandeur that Solomon intended to bring. The storehouses were full. The Phoenician craftsmen were already arriving with their specialized tools, and the cedar of Lebanon was being floated down the coast to the port of Joppa. The city stood on the precipice of a transformation that would turn the modest limestone ridge into a site of legendary splendor. As the preparations reached their peak, the focus of the city shifted finally and fully toward the threshing floor on the northern height, where the first foundations of the great house were about to be laid. Chapter 2: The House of Cedar. Solomon, the son of David, took up the task of laying those foundations with a sense of order that matched the scale of his ambition. He looked north, toward the high threshing floor his father had secured, and saw there the possibility of a permanent dwelling for the divine. This was a man whose wisdom was said to encompass the whole of the natural world, yet his primary labor in Jerusalem was one of physical and administrative organization. The preparations David had begun were now set into a rigorous, grand motion that would fundamentally alter the topography of the ridge. By expanding the city's boundaries to include the northern height, Solomon effectively shifted the center of gravity for the entire kingdom. The Temple Mount required a radical reimagining of the mountain's peak before a single stone of the sanctuary could be set. To create a platform large enough for the intended courts, the builders had to raise massive retaining walls and fill the gaps with rubble and earth. This was a labor of years, a patient accumulation of mass that leveled the uneven rock into a steady, expansive stage. The limestone blocks used for these foundations were quarried from the nearby hills, their pale surfaces reflecting the morning light as they were dragged into position by teams of oxen. Slowly, the natural ruggedness of the ridge was smoothed away, replaced by the sharp, intentional lines of monumental architecture. Hiram of Tyre played a crucial role in this transformation by providing the materials and expertise that the local Judean society lacked. The relationship between the two kings was one of mutual necessity and formal diplomacy, conducted through letters and envoys. Phoenician architects and master builders arrived in Jerusalem, bringing with them a sophisticated understanding of monumental stone cutting and timber framing. By providing the cedar and cypress of Lebanon, Hiram ensured that the temple would possess a structural integrity and a fragrance that set it apart from any other building in the region. The city became a hub of international exchange, where the raw wealth of the land was traded for the refined craftsmanship of the coast. Within the cool, resin-scented shade of the staging areas, the Phoenician masons moved with a practiced, rhythmic efficiency. These craftsmen carried with them specialized tools of bronze and iron that allowed them to shape the massive timbers with an accuracy that was almost mathematical. They used brushes dipped in a mixture of red ochre and oil to mark the cedar beams with precise geometric symbols, indicating how each piece was to be joined. These marks were not decorative, but functional, a hidden language of construction that ensured the timbers would fit together without the need for adjustment at the site. The masons worked in a state of quiet concentration, their hands stained by the pigment and the sticky sap of the wood, bridging the gap between the raw material and the sacred design. Transporting the cedar from the northern forests to the Judean hills was a logistical feat of immense proportions. The logs were lashed together into great rafts and floated down the Mediterranean coast to the port of Joppa, where they were disassembled and hauled overland. This journey involved thousands of laborers and draft animals, moving the heavy timber over steep and narrow mountain paths. The price of this cedar was paid in a steady stream of agricultural wealth, with Solomon sending 20,000 measures of wheat and 20,000 measures of pure oil to the court of Tyre every year. This was a material exchange that bound the mountain kingdom to the coastal merchant state, making the temple a product of global trade. Laborers for the project were gathered through a system of forced levies that drew men from across the tribes of Israel. They worked in monthly shifts, 30,000 men in all, spending 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home to maintain their own fields and families. This rotation ensured that the kingdom's economy did not collapse under the weight of the construction, but it also created a new sense of national identity. Men who had never traveled beyond their tribal borders now found themselves working alongside strangers, united by a common labor. The city of Jerusalem acted as a crucible for this new social order, a place where tribal loyalties began to settle into the broader structure of the state. Every stone for the temple was dressed at the quarry before it was brought to the mount, a practice intended to preserve the sanctity of the site. This meant that the sounds of hammering and chiseling remained at a distance, leaving the temple area in a state of unnatural, focused quiet. The blocks were carved so precisely that they fit together without mortar, their seams almost invisible to the naked eye. To watch the walls rise was to see a silent assembly of the earth, as if the mountain itself were growing in an orderly, premeditated fashion. This silence was a hallmark of Solomon's project, a deliberate choice that emphasized the divine nature of the work. Gold played a role in the interior that was both aesthetic and functional, covering the walls and the floors to reflect the light of the lamps. The weight of the gold leaf used was substantial, with records suggesting that hundreds of talents were hammered into thin, luminous sheets to overlay the cedar panels. Inside the sanctuary, the air was thick with the scent of wood and the faint metallic tang of the precious metal. This was a space designed to overwhelm the senses through stillness rather than movement, a repository of value that was hidden from the public eye. The light of the 10 golden lampstands shimmered against the polished surfaces, creating an environment that seemed to exist outside the normal passage of time. This era of construction was not limited to the temple alone, as Solomon also built a grand palace and administrative buildings to the south. The House of the Forest of Lebanon, named for its 45 pillars of cedar, served as an armory and a hall of judgment. The city was expanding in all directions, with new walls being raised to encompass the growing population of officials, priests, and merchants. The atmosphere was one of prosperity and bureaucratic precision, a far cry from the modest stronghold that David had first captured. Jerusalem was now a city of stone and cedar, a capital that commanded the respect of the surrounding empires. Managing the daily needs of such a large-scale project required a sophisticated system of taxation and supply. Solomon divided the kingdom into 12 administrative districts, each responsible for providing food and resources for the royal court for 1 month of the year. This ensured a constant flow of grain, livestock, and wine into the city's storehouses, supporting the thousands of people involved in the king's service. To live in Jerusalem during this time was to be part of a vast, humming machine of state, where the arrival of caravans was as regular as the rising of the sun. The city's markets were filled with goods from across the known world, from the spices of the south to the textiles of the north. It is worth noting that the historian finds in this period the roots of both the city's glory and its eventual tensions. While the temple was a unifying symbol, the heavy burden of labor and taxes required to build it placed a significant strain on the northern tribes. The splendor of the House of Cedar was purchased with a degree of social friction that remained just beneath the surface of the grand ceremonies. A quiet observer might have noticed that the unity achieved through construction was fragile, held together by the strength of Solomon's will and the administrative efficiency of his court. The city was at its zenith, but the weight of its own grandeur was already beginning to be felt. Social structures in the city shifted as the priestly class became more organized and influential. The temple required a dedicated staff to oversee the rituals, manage the storehouses, and maintain the complex system of tithes. These families lived in the vicinity of the Temple Mount, their lives governed by the cycles of the religious calendar rather than the seasons of the field. A new class of scribes also emerged, responsible for the king's correspondence and the detailed inventories of the temple's wealth. The city was becoming a center of literacy and law, a place where the spoken word was increasingly being captured in the permanence of ink and parchment. Moving the Ark of the Covenant from its tent in the city of David to the newly completed temple was the crowning moment of Solomon's reign. The procession involved the elders of Israel and the heads of the tribes, moving slowly up the slope to the sound of music and the scent of countless sacrifices. This was a symbolic elevation, a final resting place for the sacred object that had traveled with the people through the wilderness. The ark was placed within the inner sanctum, beneath the wings of 2 massive cherubim carved from olive wood and overlaid with gold. With this act, the mountain was fully consecrated, and the identity of Jerusalem as the dwelling place of the divine was firmly established. Inside the most recessed chamber, the Holy of Holies, the atmosphere was defined by a heavy, unmoving silence. There were no windows in this room, and the only light came from the presence within, reflecting softly off the golden walls. The thick curtains of blue, purple, and scarlet wool acted as a barrier to the outside world, muffling the sounds of the city and the temple courts. To stand in the adjacent chamber was to feel the weight of that silence, a stillness so deep that it seemed to vibrate in the air. The temple had become the heart of the nation, a silent anchor in a world of shifting empires. Finally, as the great projects reached their completion, the city settled into a period of relative quiet and established routine. The sound of the mason's hammer was replaced by the low murmur of the courts and the steady rhythm of the temple service. Solomon's Jerusalem was a finished work, a monument of stone and cedar that would stand for centuries as the benchmark of royal authority. The ridge that had once been a lonely Jebusite stronghold was now the center of a sophisticated state, its walls a testament to a generation of labor and vision. As the sun set over the Judean hills, the long shadows of the temple stretched across the city, marking the close of its most golden age. Chapter 3. The Water of Siloam. Iron and bronze, the tools of the builder, eventually turned toward the grim necessity of defense as the shadow of empire lengthened from the north. The prosperity of Solomon's era had cooled into a more fragile reality, and the gold that once adorned the temple now drew the hungry eyes of the Neo-Assyrian kings. By the time Hezekiah ascended the throne in the late 8th century BCE, the geopolitical landscape had shifted violently. The northern kingdom of Israel had already fallen to the Assyrian war machine, leaving Jerusalem as a lone sentinel atop its ridge. The city was no longer just a center of trade and faith, it was a target, and its survival depended on the strength of its walls and the security of its water. Hezekiah was a ruler who balanced religious reform with a pragmatic, almost obsessive focus on fortification. He watched the horizon as the Assyrian king Sennacherib moved southward, consuming city after city with a relentless mechanical efficiency. To prepare Jerusalem for the inevitable siege, Hezekiah ordered the construction of the Broad Wall, a massive defensive line that expanded the city's footprint to the western hill. This wall was not built with the elegant precision of Solomon's temple, but with a hurried utilitarian mass, often incorporating the stones of existing houses that were sacrificed for the greater safety. The sound of the city in these years was one of frantic masonry, a heavy, urgent labor that replaced the quiet liturgical rhythms of the previous century. Water remained the most critical vulnerability, as the Gihon spring sat outside the eastern walls and could easily be blocked or poisoned by an invading force. Hezekiah understood that to hold the city, he had to bring the water inside and deny it to the enemy. He conceived of an engineering project that would cut a tunnel through the solid limestone bedrock, carrying the spring's flow to a new pool in the southwestern part of the city. This was a task that required not only physical strength, but a sophisticated understanding of hydrology and acoustics. The project was kept hidden from the eyes of Assyrian scouts, a secret labor occurring deep within the bowels of the mountain. Deep beneath the surface, two teams of miners began to tunnel from opposite ends, working toward one another through the dark, unyielding rock. They moved by the flickering light of oil lamps, their lungs heavy with the smell of damp stone and the smoke of the wick. For months, they swung iron pickaxes against the limestone, the sound of their labor muffled by the weight of the earth above them. The chronicler notes that they navigated by sound, listening for the rhythmic vibrations of the opposing team's tools as they drew closer. When the rock finally thinned to a mere membrane, the two parties broke through, their voices echoing in the newfound passage as the water of the Gihon began its first journey through the new channel. Recorded history holds few artifacts as evocative as the Siloam Tunnel, a winding S-shaped passage that stretches for over 500 meters. The walls are still scarred by the pick marks of those ancient laborers, the grooves in the stone showing the frantic energy of the final breakthrough. A commemorative inscription was carved into the rock near the exit, celebrating the moment the water flowed and the laborers met. This text, written in the elegant Paleo-Hebrew script of the time, offers a rare human-scale glimpse into the pride of the builders. It is a document of sweat and triumph, etched into the very infrastructure that would allow the city to endure. In 701 BCE, the Assyrian army arrived, a vast and terrifying force that set up camp in the hills surrounding the city. Sennacherib was not merely a conqueror, but a master of psychological warfare, sending officials to the walls to deliver speeches intended to drain the defenders' resolve. He spoke of the fall of great cities and the impotence of local gods, his voice carrying over the valleys in a language the common citizens could understand. The atmosphere inside the walls was one of stifling tension, as the people watched the smoke from the Assyrian campfires rise into the blue Judean sky. The city was a cage, but it was a cage that was well watered and fortified beyond the enemy's easy reach. This particular siege was a clash of two different kinds of power: the mobile, expansive empire and the rooted, defensive sanctuary. Sennacherib boasted in his own royal annals that he had shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, yet the records are strangely silent about a final assault or the capture of the city. While other Judean cities like Lachish were systematically dismantled, Jerusalem remained an enigma that the Assyrians could not quite solve. The high walls and the hidden water supply created a stalemate that favored the besieged. To walk the ramparts in those days was to see the might of the world gathered below, and yet to feel the cold, steady reassurance of the Siloam water flowing beneath one's feet. Modern eyes might find a parallel in the way vital infrastructure often determines the fate of nations more than the glory of their monuments. The Siloam Tunnel was not built for beauty, yet its existence preserved the very culture that would later produce some of the most influential texts in human history. It was a functional necessity that became a sacred lifeline, a reminder that the endurance of the spirit is often predicated on the movement of water. The historian notes that the survival of Jerusalem in 701 BCE ensured the continuity of the Davidic line and the preservation of the temple. Without the tunnel, the story of the city might have ended in the dust of an Assyrian ledger. Inside the city walls, the daily routines of the people were compressed by the weight of the blockade. The markets were no longer filled with foreign luxuries, but with the measured rations of grain and oil that had been stored in anticipation of the crisis. Women gathered at the pool of Siloam to fill their jars, the water cool and constant regardless of the turmoil above ground. The temperature of the spring water, a steady 15 degrees Celsius, provided a sensory consistency that was perhaps the only predictable element in a city under threat. Life became a matter of waiting, of enduring the long, dry months of the Judean summer while the enemy lingered outside. Quiet intelligence guided Hezekiah's preparations, suggesting a long-term vision for the city's identity that transcended the immediate crisis. By enclosing the western hill within the broad wall, he transformed Jerusalem from a narrow ridge into a true urban center. This was the moment the city began to take on the shape it would hold for centuries, a sprawling, fortified heartland that could absorb a large refugee population. The survival of the city was seen not merely as a military success, but as a divine affirmation of its special status. This belief in the city's invulnerability began to settle into the collective consciousness, a layer of conviction as thick as the limestone walls. Eventually, the sudden departure of the Assyrian army brought an end to the immediate peril, an event attributed in the chronicles to a devastating plague that struck the camp in a single night. Whatever the cause, the sight of the empty hills the following morning must have brought a relief so profound it felt like a second founding. The iron gates were swung open, and the people poured out into the valleys to see the abandoned equipment and the remains of the siege works. The city had been tested by the greatest empire of the age and had emerged intact, its walls scarred but unbreached. The era of Hezekiah ended with a sense of miraculous preservation, a feeling that the city was protected by more than just stone and water. Prosperity returned in the years following the retreat, bringing a quiet renaissance of administrative and religious activity. The wealth that had been hidden or paid in tribute began to circulate again, though with a new caution that reflected the lessons of the siege. Hezekiah's officials continued to refine the city's records, utilizing seal impressions on storage jars to manage the kingdom's resources with meticulous care. These jars, found in the thousands by modern archaeologists, speak to a society that had become highly organized and resilient. The sound of the city was once again the murmur of the markets and the chanting in the temple courts, but the memory of the bird in a cage remained. Living in Jerusalem during the late monarchic period meant inhabiting a city of intense density and layers. The houses were built closely together, their roofs often serving as additional living spaces where families could catch the evening breeze. The smell of the city was a mixture of wood smoke, baking bread, and the iron-rich dust of the Judean hills. Even in times of peace, the presence of the walls was a constant psychological boundary, a reminder of the fragility of the peace. People walked the same narrow paths that had been laid down in the time of David, their sandals wearing smooth the steps that led up to the temple platform. 1 century later, the confidence that had been forged in the fire of the Assyrian siege would be tested by a new, more final shadow. Babylon was beginning to eclipse the power of the north, and the era of the first house was drawing toward its sunset. The city remained prosperous, and the Siloam water continued to flow, yet the geopolitical tides were turning in ways that walls alone could not stop. The ridge had survived the wolf, but it was now facing a conqueror who did not believe in stalemate. As the 7th century BCE drew to a close, the city stood on the edge of a transformation that would shatter the first house and send its people into a long, reflective silence. Chapter 4: The Shards of the First House. In the year 586 before the Common Era, that looming silence became the defining characteristic of the Judean hills. The geopolitical tides that had spared the city a century earlier now returned with a heavier, more terminal force under the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II. Jerusalem found itself caught in a tightening vice between the fading ambitions of Egypt and the rising, iron-willed administration of Babylon. The confidence that had been forged in the time of Hezekiah had turned, by this late hour, into a brittle defiance that the walls could no longer support. As the summer heat settled over the limestone ridges, the sound of the city changed from the hum of a capital to the rhythmic, muffled thud of a siege engine. Beneath the reign of Zedekiah, the last king of the Davidic line to sit in the House of Cedar, the city's administrative structures began to fray under the pressure of the blockade. The first deportation a decade earlier had already stripped the city of its craftsmen, its metal workers, and its young nobility, leaving a population that felt the absence of its skilled hands. Among those taken to the rivers of Babylon was the prophet Ezekiel, whose absence left a void in the city's spiritual council. The city that remained was one of shadows and half measures, where the golden vessels of the temple had already been partly looted to pay for a peace that would not hold. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the dry metallic dust of constant fortification. Nebuchadnezzar did not seek a stalemate. He sought the systematic dismantling of the Judean state. His engineers constructed a massive siege wall that entirely encircled Jerusalem, cutting off the flow of goods and people from the surrounding countryside. This was a war of patience and mathematics, where the Babylonians measured the height of the walls and the depth of the valleys to position their battering rams. Outside the gates, the landscape was stripped of its trees to provide timber for the ramps, leaving the hills bare and white under the sun. Inside, the people watched the slow, mechanical progress of the enemy, their hope tethered to the secret movement of the water that still pulsed through Hezekiah's tunnel. While the spring continued to flow, the granaries began to fail as the months of the blockade stretched into a second year. Hunger became a physical presence in the city, a quiet thief that settled in every house from the palace to the meanest hovel. A human-scale detail from this era remains in the archaeological record, the weight of a single, meager ration of grain, measured out with a precision that speaks of desperation. Bread was no longer baked with the fragrant, nutty richness of the harvest, but with whatever fillers could be gathered from the dust. The sound of the city was now the silence of the market, where the scales were used more often for counting the remaining seeds than for trade. Baruch the scribe sat in a cramped, dimly lit room within the palace complex, his fingers stained with the soot-black ink of his trade. He was the companion and recorder for the prophet Jeremiah, and his task was to capture the final, agonizing days of the monarchy on scrolls of papyrus and clay tablets. The weight of these tablets, cold and heavy in his lap, seemed to mirror the gravity of the words he was forced to write. He recorded the king's wavering resolve and the fierce arguments of the generals, his reed pen scratching across the surface with a persistent, lonely sound. The miniature of Baruch's labor reveals a man working against the clock of history, documenting the collapse of a world even as the sealing dust from the bombardment fell upon his parchment. By the time the month of Tammuz arrived, the city's strength had been spent. The Babylonian rams finally found a weakness in the northern wall, where the terrain was more forgiving and the defenses less formidable. A breach was made, and the sounds of the struggle spilled into the narrow streets, a low-energy movement of retreat and finality. The king fled through the king's garden toward the plains of Jericho, leaving the city to its fate. The historian observes that the fall of the city was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, inevitable crumbling of a structure that had been under pressure for too long. Fire became the final architect of the first house. The Babylonians did not merely capture the city, they systematically put it to the torch, beginning with the great temple that Solomon had built 4 centuries earlier. The cedar beams, which had once filled the sanctuary with their resinous scent, now fueled an inferno that turned the limestone walls to lime and ash. The gold that had overlaid the walls melted and ran in thin, glittering streams through the cracks in the floorboards. To watch the temple burn was to see the heart of the national identity dissolve into a pillar of smoke that could be seen from the distant hills of Moab. Beneath the modern streets of Jerusalem, archaeologists still find the burnt layer of 586 BCE, a thick deposit of carbonized wood, shattered pottery, and arrowheads. These shards are the physical remains of that final hour, evidence of a destruction so thorough that the city ceased to function as a living entity. The taste of the air in those days must have been bitter, with the soot of centuries of history being erased in a single season. This layer of ash acts as a silent boundary in the earth, a dark line that separates the era of the First Temple from everything that would follow. It is a human-scale reminder that empires do not just conquer, they leave a physical residue of their passing. Gold and bronze vessels, the treasures of the sanctuary that had survived the initial looting, were now gathered by the Babylonian officers for transport to the east. The census of these items was recorded with a cold, administrative efficiency. The bowls, the spoons, the lampstands, and the massive bronze pillars named Jachin and Boaz. These pillars, which had stood as sentinels of the temple's stability, were broken into pieces to make them easier to carry across the desert. The sound of the bronze being struck and shattered echoed through the ruins, a discordant end to the harmony that Solomon had envisioned. The wealth of the city was reduced to a list of weight and material, destined for the storehouses of a foreign god. Leaving the city behind, the survivors were gathered into long, slow-moving columns for the march to Babylon. This was a journey of hundreds of miles through the desert, a transition from the mountainous heights they had always known to the flat, alluvial plains of Mesopotamia. The rhythm of the march was set by the pace of the old and the young, their sandals wearing thin on the hot sand. The city they left behind was a hollow shell, a place of broken walls and scorched earth where the wind whistled through the empty window frames of the palace. The geography of the exile was one of vast distances and the ache of displacement, a stretching of the national soul until it reached the breaking point. Sitting by the rivers of Babylon, the exiles found that their identity was no longer tied to a specific stone or a particular building. They began to gather their traditions and their stories, realizing that the memory of the city was a portable sanctuary that could be carried in the mind. The Book of Lamentations, written in the wake of the fall, captures this era of reflection, its verses moving with the slow, heavy cadence of a funeral dirge. The voice of the chronicler notes that this period of loss was also a period of intense intellectual and spiritual productivity. Without the temple, the people turned to the Word, and the scriptures began to take the shape they would hold for the coming millennia. For 70 years, the ridge of the Ophel remained a place of desolation, its silence broken only by the occasional cry of a jackal or the rustle of the weeds growing in the temple courts. A few impoverished families remained in the surrounding hills, scratching a living from the parched earth and looking toward the ruins with a mixture of reverence and fear. The Gihon spring continued to flow, its water pulsing into a pool that was now surrounded by rubble rather than walls. This was the era of the shattered house, a time when the city was more a memory than a reality, a ghost of its former self, lingering in the Judean air. This era of displacement serves as a quiet interval in the city's long melody. The focus of history shifted eastward to the Hanging Gardens and the ziggurats of Babylon, where the Judean elite lived as strangers in a strange land. They maintained their records, they kept their genealogies, and they waited for a change in the political winds. The city of Jerusalem existed during these decades as a conceptual anchor, a place that people turned toward when they prayed, even if they could no longer see its walls. It was a city of the mind, a landscape of longing that was kept alive through the persistent repetition of its history. Silence eventually gave way to the sound of a new decree when the Persian Empire eclipsed the power of Babylon. Cyrus the Great, a ruler whose administrative style favored the restoration of local cults, issued a proclamation that allowed the exiles to return and rebuild. This was not a sudden, massive migration, but a slow and cautious trickle of people who were willing to trade the stability of the East for the ruins of the West. They carried with them the same gold and bronze vessels that had been taken decades earlier, their return a symbolic closing of a circle. The city of the first house was gone, but the city of the second house was about to begin its long, patient ascent. Chapter 5: The Return and the Rubble. The collapse of the Babylonian administrative machine followed the inevitable path of overextended empires, drifting eventually into the orbit of the rising Persian power under Cyrus the Great. When the Persians entered the city of Babylon in 539 before the Common Era, they brought with them a different philosophy of governance, one that favored the restoration of displaced peoples to their ancestral homes. This shift in geopolitical strategy was the direct catalyst for the first small, cautious groups of Judeans to begin their journey back across the desert toward the ruins of the West. They did not return to a city of glory, but to a landscape where the silence of 7 decades had allowed the weeds and the wild animals to reclaim the streets. The decree of Cyrus was a formal administrative act that turned the exiles into pioneers, tasked with rebuilding a capital that existed mostly in the memories of their elders. Zerubbabel, a descendant of the royal line, led the first wave of returnees with a focus on the immediate restoration of the altar. They arrived to find the Temple Mount overgrown with thorns, the massive ashlar blocks of Solomon's era toppled and blackened by the ancient fires. The scale of the desolation was such that the work of clearing the rubble required more effort than the actual construction of new walls. Every step through the ruins involved navigating a landscape of broken pottery and scorched timber, the physical shards of the first house still lying exactly where they had fallen. To live in the city during these early years was to exist in a state of constant, dusty labor, as the returnees scratched a living from the parched earth while attempting to re-establish the sacred routines. Persistence eventually yielded a modest second temple, though it lacked the gold and the cedar-scented grandeur of its predecessor. When the foundations were laid, the elders who remembered the first temple wept at the comparison, their voices mingling with the shouts of joy from the younger generation who saw only a new beginning. This tension between the remembered past and the struggling present defined the atmosphere of the ridge for many years. The city was a collection of small houses clustered around the temple site, while the vast majority of the old fortifications remained in a state of collapse. It was a capital without walls, a condition of vulnerability that left the inhabitants exposed to the raids and the mockery of their neighbors. Decades passed before a high official in the Persian court named Nehemiah received word of the city's continued distress. He was a man of significant administrative influence, yet the news of Jerusalem's broken gates and charred walls affected him with a physical weight. After securing the permission of King Artaxerxes, he arrived in the city not with an army, but with a commission to rebuild the fortifications. He spent his first few days in quiet observation, refusing to reveal his plans until he had grasped the true extent of the ruin. The city he saw was a skeletal version of the one described in the scrolls, a place where the geography of defense had been entirely erased by time and neglect. Under the silver light of a waning moon, Nehemiah set out on a secret inspection of the city's perimeter. He rode a single horse, accompanied by a few trusted men on foot, moving through the valley gate toward the Dragon's Well and the Dung Gate. The path was so choked with fallen stones and tangled brush that at several points the horse could no longer find a footing, forcing the party to pick their way through the debris on foot. In the deep silence of the Kidron Valley, the only sounds were the soft clatter of hooves against limestone and the occasional, lonely cry of a nightbird echoing from the ruins of the Ophel. This miniature of a leader navigating the wreckage of his heritage captures the exact moment when the conceptual city of the exile began to turn back into a physical reality of stone and mortar. Rebuilding the walls became a project of intense, communal focus that Nehemiah organized by family and guild. He assigned specific sections of the wall to different groups, creating a sense of local ownership over the defenses that protected their own homes. Because of the constant threat from surrounding governors who opposed the fortification, the laborers worked in a state of quiet, vigilant readiness. The records describe men holding a trowel in one hand and a spear in the other, though the reality was likely a more patient system of guards and shifts. The sound of the city returned to the rhythmic clink of the mason's hammer, a persistent, low-energy beat that signaled the closing of the gaps and the restoration of the gates. Stone by stone, the perimeter began to rise from the mounds of rubble that had lain untouched for nearly a century. The builders did not always have the luxury of newly quarried limestone, instead utilizing the very blocks that had been cast down by the Babylonians. They cleared the silt and the ash from the old foundations, finding that the bedrock remained as steady as it had been in the days of David. The human-scale detail of this labor was the constant presence of the limestone dust, a fine white powder that coated the hands and the clothes of every citizen. As the walls reached their full height, the sense of vulnerability that had plagued the returnees began to settle into a new, quiet confidence. One might observe from a distance that the act of rebuilding a city is as much a psychological process as it is an engineering one. By enclosing the ridge once more, Nehemiah was not just providing security, he was re-establishing the boundary between the sacred center and the outer world. The historian finds it notable that the walls were completed in just 52 days, a testament to the focused energy of a people who felt they were reclaiming their place in the world. The city was once again a defined space, a stronghold that could protect its inhabitants and its traditions from the shifting political winds of the Persian Empire. Inside the newly secured walls, the focus shifted from the physical defenses to the social and religious structures that would govern the community. Ezra the scribe arrived from Babylon, carrying with him the gathered scrolls of the law and a mandate to re-establish the ancient customs. He gathered the people at the Watergate, standing upon a wooden platform to read the texts aloud from dawn until midday. The sound of his voice, steady and unhurried, carried across the crowded square, providing a textual foundation that matched the stone foundations of the walls. This was the moment the city transitioned from a fortress to a school, a place where the identity of the people was being codified in the permanence of the written word. The administrative weight of the city grew as Nehemiah instituted reforms to address the economic hardships of the poor. He demanded that the wealthy return lands and forgive debts, ensuring that the city did not collapse under the weight of internal inequality. To live in Jerusalem during this era was to be part of an experiment in social cohesion, where the shared labor of the walls was followed by the shared responsibility of the law. The city's markets began to function again, though the goods were more modest than the luxuries of the Solomonic era. People traded local grain, oil, and wool, their transactions recorded on small shards of pottery that modern excavators still find in the soil. Warmth returns to the chronicle as we consider how the returnees viewed their place in the long history of the ridge. They were aware that their temple was smaller and their wealth was lesser, yet they felt a profound sense of continuity with the past. They walked the same paths as their ancestors, utilized the same spring for their water, and looked out over the same valleys. The asides of context suggest that this period of the Second Temple was characterized by a deep, quiet resilience, a realization that the survival of the city did not depend on the glitter of gold, but on the persistence of the community. The city had become a palimpsest, where the new life was written directly over the faint but enduring lines of the old. Eventually, the city's population was bolstered by a decree that 1 in 10 people from the surrounding villages should move into the capital to ensure its vitality. This brought new energy and a diverse range of skills into the narrow streets, filling the empty houses and enlivening the temple courts. The atmosphere of the city was one of settled, productive routine, a long period of Persian peace that allowed the traditions to mature and the records to be refined. The sound of the city was the murmur of the study halls and the low-energy movement of the temple service, a steady pulse that would continue for 2 centuries. Time flowed with the same unhurried pace as the Gihon Spring during this long interval of the Persian period. The city did not seek to expand its borders or challenge the empires of the East. It remained a quiet provincial capital focused on the internal logic of its own law. The limestone walls weathered and grew grey under the sun, becoming part of the natural landscape of the hills. Generation after generation lived and died within the perimeter that Nehemiah had restored, their lives governed by the cycles of the Sabbath and the seasons of the harvest. Jerusalem had reached a state of rest, a period of gathering strength before the next great shift in the world's power. Persian rule remained distant and generally benevolent, requiring only the steady payment of taxes and the maintenance of order. The city functioned as a semi-autonomous temple state, where the high priest took on many of the administrative roles once held by the kings. This shift from monarchy to theocracy was a fundamental change in the city's character, making the temple the singular focus of all civic and religious life. The sounds of the city were now the sounds of the liturgy and the legal debates of the elders, a culture of the book that was beginning to take root in the very stone of the ridge. As the 4th century before the Common Era drew toward its close, the quiet peace of the Persian era began to feel the first tremors of a change coming from the west. A new power was rising in Macedonia, led by a young king whose ambitions would redraw the map of the known world. The city of the returnees, with its modest temple and its resilient walls, stood on the edge of a transformation that would bring the Greek language and the Greek mind to its gates. The era of the rubble was over, and the era of the Greek shift was about to begin, carrying the city into a new and more complex world. Chapter 6. The Greek Shift. Hellenism arrived in the Judean hills not as a sudden storm, but as a slow, inevitable tide that transformed the language of administration and the very shape of the city's civic life. For 2 centuries, the Persian administrative system had allowed Jerusalem to function as a quiet, semi-autonomous temple state, but the victory of Alexander the Great at Issus in 333 before the Common Era signaled the end of that Eastern orientation. The world was suddenly tilting toward the Mediterranean, bringing with it a culture that prized the gymnasium as much as the sanctuary and the philosophy of the marketplace as much as the law of the scroll. This shift was more than a change of masters. It was an encounter with an entirely different way of organizing human experience. Alexander's march toward the Egyptian border brought him through the coastal plains of Palestine, yet the inland ridge of Jerusalem remained a point of strategic and symbolic necessity. While many cities fell through siege and salt, the Judean capital maintained a posture of cautious diplomacy, recognizing that the old Persian shield had been irrevocably shattered. The chronicler observes that the transition was marked by a quiet pragmatism, as the priestly elite sought to preserve the sanctity of the temple within the framework of a new global empire. This was the moment the city truly entered the Greek world, a period when the sounds of the Aramaic marketplace began to mingle with the fluid, rhythmic vowels of the Koine Greek tongue. According to the accounts of the historian Josephus, the meeting between the young Macedonian king and the high priest Jaddua occurred at a place called Sappha, an elevation that offered a clear, commanding view of the city and the temple. Jaddua had dressed in his formal robes of purple and scarlet, wearing the golden mitre inscribed with the sacred name, and he led a procession of priests in white linen through the gates to meet the conqueror. Alexander, instead of demanding a show of force, is said to have approached the priest with a gesture of respect that surprised his own generals, acknowledging the antiquity and the gravity of the institution he was encountering. This miniature of the meeting on the mountain represents a rare moment of equilibrium between the kinetic energy of the West and the rooted tradition of the East. It was a diplomatic encounter rendered in the soft light of the Judean morning, a pause in the march of empire that allowed the city to retain its internal order. Ptolemaic rule followed the death of Alexander, placing Jerusalem under the administration of the Greek kings based in Alexandria for over a century. During this era, the city functioned as a vital, if quiet, province of the Egyptian Greek Empire, paying its taxes in silver drachmae and grain. The drachma itself, a heavy silver coin often stamped with the image of an owl or the profile of a king, became a common weight in the city's commerce, a physical reminder of the global economy that now encompassed the ridge. People in the markets began to handle these coins with a practiced familiarity, their silver surfaces worn smooth by the fingers of merchants and laborers alike. This period was characterized by a steady, low-energy integration into the Hellenistic world, where the external forms of the state were Greek, while the internal life of the temple remained traditionally Judean. Material changes to the city's fabric began to appear as the influence of Greek architecture drifted upward from the coastal cities. New houses were built with peristyle courtyards and decorated with the subtle, geometric patterns favored by Hellenistic craftsmen, shifting the aesthetic from the stark utility of the Persian era towards something more refined. The limestone, always the primary material of the ridge, was now carved into the elegant shapes of Ionic and Corinthian columns for the more prominent dwellings. These buildings did not replace the old city, but they sat among the ancient foundations like a new layer of skin, a visual testament to the cultural blending that was occurring within the walls. The smell of the city changed slightly as well, as Mediterranean oils and perfumes became more widely available in the stalls of the lower market. Institutional tensions eventually surfaced as the city's youth began to find the attractions of the Greek lifestyle more compelling than the rigorous requirements of the law. To the north of the temple, a gymnasium was established, a site dedicated to athletic training and the study of Greek literature, where the practice of exercising in the nude directly challenged the traditional Judean sense of modesty. This building represented a new center of gravity, a space where the intellect and the body were celebrated in ways that felt fundamentally alien to the priestly class. The interpretive aside offered by the historian is that the city was now a house divided not by walls, but by values, a struggle between those who looked toward the ancestral traditions and those who wished to become citizens of a broader, more cosmopolitan world. The shift from Ptolemaic to Seleucid control at the turn of the 2nd century before the Common Era brought a more aggressive form of Hellenization to the city's gates. Antiochus III had been welcomed as a liberator, but his successor, Antiochus IV, viewed the city as a strategic asset that needed to be fully integrated into the Greek cultural and religious sphere. He was a man of impulsive, often theatrical ambition, who styled himself Epiphanes, or God Manifest, and he had little patience for the unique sensitivities of the temple state. Under his administration, the city's autonomy was curtailed, and the resources of the temple were increasingly viewed as a treasury to fund the king's military campaigns against the Romans and the Egyptians. Antiochus eventually crossed a threshold of policy that turned cultural tension into open, violent revolt. In 167 before the Common Era, he issued a decree that prohibited the practice of the Judean law, ordered the burning of the scrolls, and placed a statue of Zeus within the inner sanctum of the temple. This abomination of desolation was not merely a military occupation. It was an attempt to rewrite the city's core identity through an act of supreme symbolic violence. The daily sacrifices ceased, the temple courts fell into a state of mournful neglect, and the sound of the city was replaced by the clank of the Seleucid garrison stationed in the Aqsa fortress. The ridge was at its lowest point since the Babylonian exile, its sacred heart silenced by the will of a distant king. One might observe that the reaction to this pressure came from the rural hills rather than the urban elite. Mattathias, a priest from the village of Modi'in, initiated a resistance that was carried forward by his sons, most notably Judas, who was nicknamed Maccabeus, or the Hammer. They conducted a guerrilla war of movement and ambush, utilizing the rugged terrain of the Judean wilderness to neutralize the superior numbers of the Greek phalanxes. The conflict was a slow, grinding affair that moved through the valleys and the mountain passes, drawing the city's attention toward the heights. The Maccabean revolt was a reclamation of the landscape, a struggle to restore the boundary between the sacred and the profane that Antiochus had sought to dissolve. Consequence-led history finds its most enduring image in the rededication of the temple in 164 before the Common Era. After a series of unlikely victories, the Maccabean forces entered Jerusalem and began the work of clearing the pollution from the sanctuary. They dismantled the pagan altar, purified the courts, and sought to relight the great lampstand that had stood as a symbol of the divine presence. The human-scale detail of this moment is the search for a single jar of consecrated olive oil, its clay surface still sealed with the mark of the high priest. The small, flickering flames of the lamps, burning in the dim light of the restored sanctuary, provided a visual anchor for a city that had nearly lost its soul. The Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah, became a permanent addition to the city's calendar, a celebration of the light that persisted against the dark. Judas and his brothers, Jonathan and Simon, consolidated their power to establish the Hasmonean dynasty, the first local monarchy to rule from Jerusalem since the fall of the first house. They were priest-kings, a dual role that brought both authority and controversy to their administration of the city. To secure their position, they expanded the city's fortifications and finally reduced the Aqsa fortress, the last stronghold of the pro-Greek faction. Jerusalem began to grow in physical size, expanding onto the western hill and incorporating new residential districts that reflected the rising wealth of the Hasmonean court. The sound of the city was once again the hum of construction and the busy administrative movement of a sovereign state. Geographic expansion was a defining trait of the Hasmonean century as the city's population surged with the influx of pilgrims and new residents from across the expanded Judean territory. A new bridge was constructed to link the Temple Mount with the Western Hill, allowing for easier movement between the administrative and religious centers of the city. This era saw the development of the Upper City, an affluent district where the priestly families built grand houses overlooking the temple courts. The architecture remained a blend of local limestone and Greek form, but the focus was now entirely on the city's role as the capital of a resurgent, independent kingdom. To walk the streets in this era was to feel the energy of a nation that had reclaimed its center. Institutional maturity brought with it a complex legal and political landscape as different factions began to compete for influence over the city's future. The Pharisees, who focused on the scrupulous observance of the law by the common people, often found themselves at odds with the Sadducees, the aristocratic priestly class that managed the temple service. These debates were conducted in the courtyards and the study halls, their voices adding a layer of intellectual intensity to the city's atmosphere. The chronicler notes that Jerusalem was becoming a city of the mind as much as a city of stone, a place where the interpretation of the law was a matter of life and death. This internal friction, though quiet, was a sign of the city's growing complexity and the weight of its own success. Kings of the Hasmonean line, particularly Alexander Jannaeus, adopted the trappings of Hellenistic royalty even as they defended the Judean law. They minted their own coins, often with bilingual inscriptions in Greek and Paleo-Hebrew, and they maintained a court that rivaled the surrounding principalities in its sophistication. This was a period of high political drama and territorial expansion, yet the human-scale reality remained one of seasonal rhythms and the steady demands of the temple. The city was a machine of sacrifice and study, its air filled with the smell of roasting meat and the dust of the pilgrims' feet. Jerusalem was no longer a provincial outpost. It was a regional power that commanded the attention of both the East and the West. Finally, as the 1st century before the Common Era opened, the Hasmonean kingdom began to fray under the pressure of internal dynastic strife and the approaching shadow of the Roman Republic. Two brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, fought for the throne, eventually appealing to the Roman general Pompey to settle their dispute. The Greek shift had brought independence and growth, but it had also brought the city into the orbit of a power that would not rest until the entire Mediterranean was a Roman lake. The independence of the ridge was drawing toward its sunset, and the Roman shadow was beginning to stretch across the Judean hills. Chapter 7. The Edomite Architect. Not a single stone of the old Hasmonean palace could provide a steady enough foundation for the era of monumental ambition that followed the arrival of the Roman legions. The independence that had been won by the Maccabees and managed by their descendants had become, by the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, a fractured thing of civil strife and dynastic competition. When the Roman general Pompey entered the city in 63 before the Common Era, he found a capital divided against itself, a state of affairs that allowed Rome to settle into the Judean hills with a heavy administrative finality. The ridge was no longer a sovereign kingdom. It was a client state of an expanding Mediterranean republic, and its future was to be shaped by a man whose origins lay in the southern deserts of Edom. Herod, known to history as the Great, was an outsider who sought to buy the legitimacy he lacked through the sheer scale of his architectural vision. He was a master of Roman engineering and a student of the Hellenistic aesthetic, a man who believed that the loyalty of a people could be secured through the building of monuments that transcended the human scale. His ascent to the throne in 37 before the Common Era began a period of construction that would fundamentally and permanently alter the skyline of Jerusalem. The city became a vast workshop, its air filled with the dust of white marble and the rhythmic, persistent sound of thousands of chisels carving the local limestone into the sharp, clean lines of the Roman world. To achieve his vision, Herod undertook the expansion of the Temple Mount, a project that required the doubling of the existing platform's size and the leveling of the surrounding terrain. This was an engineering feat of immense proportions, involving the construction of massive retaining walls that plunged deep into the valleys and rose hundreds of feet above the bedrock. These walls were built of ashlar blocks, enormous rectangles of limestone characterized by their Herodian borders, a shallow, precisely carved frame around a smooth central boss. These stones were not held together by mortar, but by their own staggering weight and the precision of their fit, creating a structure that felt as solid and unmoving as the mountain itself. Beneath the southeastern corner of the mount, the workers labored in a state of quiet, focused intensity to set the foundations of what would become the largest man-made platform in the ancient world. The human-scale detail of this labor was the installation of the master course, a layer of stones so large that they remain a marvel of ancient logistics. The largest of these blocks, a single piece of limestone weighing over 500 tons, was dragged into place along a system of rollers and ramps, its movement a slow, groaning progression of mass against friction. The miniature of this event reveals the master masons standing atop the stone, signaling to the teams of laborers with steady, measured gestures as the block was eased into its final, permanent rest. This was the silent bedrock of Herod's ambition, a physical anchor that would survive the fires and the sieges of the coming century. Westerners today recognize a portion of these retaining walls as the Wailing Wall, yet in Herod's time, this was merely a functional boundary of a much larger and more grander complex. The limestone used for the walls was so white and so polished that, under the intense Judean sun, it reflected a brilliance that made the temple appear as if it were a mountain of snow or a city carved from cloud. To walk beside these walls was to feel a sense of insignificance, as the scale of the masonry surpassed the familiar proportions of the human body. The stones were cool to the touch, their surfaces smoothed by the labor of thousands of craftsmen who had been trained by the priests themselves to work within the sacred precincts. Herod's influence extended beyond the temple to the northwestern corner of the mount, where he constructed the Antonia Fortress, a massive military complex named for his Roman patron, Mark Antony. This fortress was a city within a city, with 4 high towers that allowed the Roman garrison to look down into the temple courts and maintain a watchful, administrative eye over the crowds. It was a structure of utility and surveillance, a physical reminder that the sanctuary existed within the shadow of the empire. The sound of the fortress was the clank of iron armor and the steady, rhythmic pacing of the sentries on the battlements, a stark contrast to the low-energy movement of the liturgy below. Inside the temple courts, the atmosphere was defined by the royal stoa, a grand basilica that ran along the southern edge of the platform. This was a place of commerce and law, with rows of massive Corinthian columns supporting a roof of carved cedar and gold leaf. The scent of the stoa was a mixture of wood smoke, old parchment, and the sharp, resinous aroma of the cedar, creating a sensory environment that spoke of both wealth and tradition. It was here that the money changers sat, their tables laden with the silver shekels required for the temple tax, and where the elders gathered to discuss the finer points of the law. The city's administrative heart was now housed in a structure that rivaled the grandest halls of Rome or Alexandria. Administrative efficiency was a hallmark of Herod's reign, as he managed the complex logistics of the temple service with the same precision he applied to his building projects. To ensure the sanctity of the construction, he trained 1,000 priests as masons and carpenters, allowing them to perform the work in the inner sanctum where no layman was permitted to enter. This was a gesture of respect toward the tradition, yet it was also a strategic act of control, making the king the indispensable architect of the sacred space. The daily routine of the city was governed by the progress of the work, with thousands of families supported by the constant demand for labor and materials. One might observe from a distance that the city had reached its physical and economic zenith during this era of Herodian rule. Jerusalem was no longer just a mountain stronghold. It was a cosmopolitan center that attracted pilgrims and merchants from across the Mediterranean world. They brought with them the languages and the currencies of the empire, mingling in the narrow streets that Herod had paved with smooth, flat stones to allow for the passage of carts and carriages. The wealth of the city was reflected in the grand houses of the upper city, where the priestly elite lived in villas decorated with frescoes and mosaics, their lifestyle a blend of Judean custom and Roman luxury. Living in the city during the late 1st century before the Common Era meant inhabiting a landscape of constant, monumental growth. The sounds of the market, the low murmur of trade, the bleating of sheep for sacrifice, and the calls of the street vendors were now layered over the permanent background rhythm of the construction. The air was filled with the smell of incense from the temple, a heavy aromatic cloud of frankincense and myrrh that settled in the valleys and clung to the stone walls. This scent was the olfactory signature of the city, a reminder that every aspect of life was oriented toward the mountain and the rituals that occurred upon it. Quiet tensions remained beneath the surface of this architectural splendor as the people grappled with the contradictions of Herod's rule. He was their king, yet he was an Edomite. He was the builder of the temple, yet he was a friend of Caesar. He was the defender of the law, yet he built theaters and hippodromes for the Greek games. The interpretive aside offered by the chronicler is that the stones of the temple were meant to hide these fractures, providing a visual unity that the society itself could not achieve. The grandeur of the Edomite architect was a mask of white marble, a magnificent structure built over a foundation of simmering dissent and the approaching weight of Roman direct rule. Geographic reality dictated that the city's expansion must move westward as the eastern valleys remained too steep for significant development. Herod built a new palace for himself on the highest point of the western hill, protected by 3 massive towers named for his brother, his friend, and his wife. These towers, Phasael, Hippicus, and Mariamne, stood as sentinels over the city, their height and strength a testament to the king's paranoia as much as his power. The palace itself was a place of gardens, pools, and intricate stone carvings, a secluded enclave of luxury that overlooked the crowded streets and the bustling temple courts. Finally, as the reign of Herod drew to its close in the year 4 before the Common Era, the city he left behind was a masterpiece of stone and ambition. The temple was nearly complete, a structure so grand and so beautiful that it was said that one who had not seen it had never seen a beautiful building in their life. The ridge had been transformed into a plateau of white marble and golden ornament, a city that was now a fixture of the global imagination. The legacy of the Edomite architect was a landscape that invited the world to look toward Jerusalem, even as the Roman shadow began to settle more permanently across the Judean hills. Time in the post-Herodian city slowed as the administrative control passed to his sons and then to the Roman procurators. The era of the great building projects was over, leaving behind a city that was as fragile as it was magnificent. The sounds of the city were now the sounds of the Roman garrison in the Antonia and the increasingly urgent debates in the temple courts. The ridge had become a place of intense, concentrated energy, a site of religious fervor and political tension that would soon collide with the cold reality of the empire. The city was at its peak, but the horizon was already beginning to darken with the first signs of the coming storm. Chapter 8: The Roman Shadow. Gessius Florus, the last of the Roman procurators to govern the province from the coastal city of Caesarea, arrived in Jerusalem with an administrative heavy-handedness that finally snapped the fragile peace Herod had built. By the mid-60s of the 1st century, the tension between the Roman authorities and the local population had moved beyond the level of quiet disagreement. The demand for 17 talents from the temple treasury, ostensibly to settle unpaid taxes, acted as the final catalyst for a city already simmering with religious and political fervor. This was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, gathering storm that began with the seizure of the gates and the expulsion of the Roman garrison from the Antonia fortress. The sound of the city changed as the liturgy was drowned out by the clanging of iron on wood, as citizens began the frantic work of reinforcing the walls for a conflict they knew was coming. General Vespasian was dispatched by Nero to suppress the uprising, moving with a methodical, Roman patience that saw the surrounding Judean countryside systematically reduced before the capital was ever approached. He understood that Jerusalem, with its massive Herodian walls and deep valleys, could not be taken in a single kinetic rush. Instead, the legions moved like a slow tide, isolating the city and allowing the internal pressures to do the work of the sword. To live in the city during this time was to watch the horizon for the glint of Roman armor, while the price of grain in the markets rose to levels that only the wealthiest could afford. The atmosphere was one of stifling, claustrophobic anticipation, a city holding its breath as the perimeter narrowed. Inside the walls, the struggle was not merely against Rome, but between rival factions of the rebellion who fought for control of the sacred precincts. The zealots and the followers of Simon Bar-Giora turned the temple courts into a series of fortified camps, their disputes often turning as bitter as the war with the legions. Amidst this inner city strife, a moment of profound administrative loss occurred when the public archives were put to the torch. These buildings, situated near the council house, held the genealogies of the people and the records of their debts, providing the social and legal glue that held the society together. The miniature of this event shows the black smoke rising from the parchment and papyrus as centuries of carefully maintained history dissolved into grey ash. One might observe that by destroying the records of their obligations, the insurgents were attempting to reset the social order, yet they were also erasing the memory of the very people they sought to lead. Titus, the son of Vespasian, took command of the siege in the year 70 after his father was proclaimed emperor in Rome. He brought 4 legions to the city's gates, setting up camps on the Mount of Olives and the northern plateau, effectively severing Jerusalem from the outside world. The Romans began the construction of a circumvallation wall, a 5-mile-long barricade of earth and timber that ensured no person or morsel of food could enter or leave the city. This was a war of duration, where the caloric deficit of the population was calculated by the Roman engineers with the same precision as the trajectory of a catapult stone. The silence that settled over the city was no longer the silence of prayer, but the silence of a population whose strength was being drawn out by the steady, unmoving pressure of the blockade. Rams and siege towers were eventually brought against the third wall, the outermost defense that had been begun by Agrippa the War and finished in haste by the rebels. The sound of the iron-headed rams striking the limestone was a persistent, low-frequency thud that vibrated through the earth and could be felt in the foundations of the houses. Roman soldiers, protected by their interlocking shields in the testudo formation, labored at the base of the walls to clear the debris and find a point of entry. To watch from the battlements was to see a machine of state moving with a cold, repetitive energy, a force that did not tire or waver. The pale Judean limestone began to show the scars of the assault, with massive chips and cracks appearing where the heavy stones from the ballistae had struck. Famine became the most effective weapon in the Roman arsenal, settling into the narrow alleys of the lower city and the villas of the upper city with an equal, devastating weight. The chronicler notes that the search for food became an obsession that stripped away the layers of social decorum as people scoured the gutters for scraps of leather or hay. There was a quiet, desperate dignity in the way some families chose to remain in their homes, accepting the inevitable rather than participating in the chaos of the streets. The human-scale reality was the weight of a single, parched throat and the sight of the dust settling on empty plates. In this state of extreme deprivation, the city's resistance continued with a brittle, ghost-like persistence, a testament to the belief that the mountain could never truly fall. The breach of the Antonia fortress allowed the Romans to gain a foothold overlooking the temple courts, placing the final target of the campaign within their sight. Titus is said to have wished to preserve the temple as a monument to Roman victory, yet the chaos of the final assault made such intentions impossible to fulfill. During the heat of the summer month of Ab, a Roman soldier threw a burning brand through a window of the sanctuary, igniting the dry cedar beams and the thick embroidered curtains. The fire spread with a rapid, devouring hunger, the resinous wood providing an intense heat that caused the very stones to crack and shatter. To watch the temple burn was to see the end of a world, as the smoke filled the Kidron Valley and the light of the flames could be seen as far as the coastal plain. Rome's victory was marked by the systematic dismantling of the city's structures, a process of unbuilding that was as thorough as Herod's construction had been. The walls were leveled, the palaces were burned, and the massive ashlar blocks of the temple platform were cast down into the valleys below. Only the three towers of Herod's palace, Phasael, Hippicus, and Mariamne, were left standing as a reminder of the strength of the city that the Romans had overcome. The sound of the city was now the sound of the pickaxe and the crowbar, as the legions labored to ensure that Jerusalem could never again serve as a center of rebellion. The ridge was returned to a state of desolation, its silence broken only by the movements of the 10th Legion Fretensis, which remained as a permanent garrison amidst the ruins. Evidence of this era remains etched into the Arch of Titus in Rome, where the triumphal procession is depicted in a series of deep relief carvings. The soldiers are shown carrying the treasures of the temple, the golden table, the silver trumpets, and the seven-branched menorah, their weight and form captured with a cold, commemorative accuracy. A quiet observer might notice the soot that still clings to the recesses of the marble, a physical residue of the fires that consumed the city. This arch was not built for the Judeans, but for the Roman public, a visual argument for the inevitability of Roman power and the total eclipse of the Jewish state. Back on the ridge, the 10th Legion utilized the bricks stamped with their own emblem, a boar and a galley, to build their barracks, a material sign of the new foreign administration. Hadrian, visiting the ruins nearly 60 years later, decided to rebuild the city not as a Judean capital, but as a Roman colony named Aelia Capitolina. He sought to erase the memory of the old city entirely, laying out a new grid of streets that ignored the ancient topography and the sacred traditions of the site. A temple dedicated to Jupiter Capitolinus was planned for the very spot where the Second Temple had stood, a move that sparked a second, equally bitter revolt under the leader Simon Bar Kokhba. This final struggle resulted in the total banishment of the Jewish population from the city and the renaming of the province from Judea to Syria Palestina. The ridge was now a Roman landscape, its identity rewritten in the language of the empire and the architecture of the Forum. Walking the streets of Aelia Capitolina meant navigating a city of order, symmetry, and pagan ritual. The Cardo Maximus, a grand colonnaded thoroughfare, ran north to south, its smooth stones reflecting the light of a city that had been designed by the Roman mind. The smell of the city was now the smell of the public baths and the incense of the Roman gods, a sensory environment that would have been unrecognizable to the contemporaries of David or Solomon. The human-scale detail of this era was the sound of the Latin tongue in the marketplace and the sight of the Roman eagles on the city gates. Jerusalem had become a provincial outpost of the Mediterranean world, a place where the past was buried beneath a layer of Roman paving stones. Interpretive asides from the historians suggest that this period of the Roman shadow was the city's most profound transformation, a time when its physical and spiritual continuity was almost entirely severed. Yet, beneath the Roman grid and the temples of Jupiter, the ancient foundations remained, waiting in the dark for the next shift in the world's power. The Gihon spring continued to pulse, its water flowing through Hezekiah's tunnel even as the city above it changed its name and its language. The ridge was a landscape of deep memory, and the Roman layer, for all its strength and order, was merely another skin over the eternal limestone. As the 2nd century drew toward its close, the Roman Empire itself began to experience the first tremors of the internal shifts that would eventually lead to the rise of Christianity. The city of Aelia Capitolina remained a quiet, orderly place, a veterans' colony settled in the Judean hills, yet it was about to be rediscovered by a new kind of pilgrim. The Roman shadow was long, but it was not permanent, and the era of the cross and the stone was beginning to flicker on the horizon. The focus of the world would soon return to the ridge, not for its walls or its fortresses, but for the events that had occurred within its shadow. Chapter 9: The Cross and the Stone. In the year 324 of the Common Era, the political and spiritual center of the Mediterranean world underwent a transformation that reached even the remote veterans' colony of Aelia Capitolina. The victory of Constantine at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge had set in motion a series of administrative shifts that slowly stripped the city of its pagan Roman identity. Jerusalem, which had existed as a quiet provincial outpost for over 2 centuries, suddenly found itself rediscovered as the geographical and theological heart of a now Christian empire. This was a period of rediscovery, a time when the memories of the early faith were unearthed from beneath the layers of Roman paving stones and the temples of the Olympian gods. Bishop Macarius of Jerusalem, attending the Council of Nicaea, successfully lobbied the Emperor Constantine to restore the city's ancient status and to locate the site of the crucifixion and resurrection. This request aligned with the emperor's desire to anchor his new imperial order in a physical, historical landscape. The city began to emerge from the shadow of the 10th Legion's barracks, transitioning from a military stronghold into a destination for the entire Christian world. The administrative energy of the empire was now directed toward the ridge, bringing with it the funds and the architects necessary to reshape the city's silhouette once again. Helena, the mother of Constantine, arrived in the city in 326 as a royal pilgrim with the specific mission of identifying the sacred sites described in the scriptures. She was a woman of advanced years but persistent energy, traveling through the provinces with a large retinue and the authority of the imperial court. Her presence in Jerusalem marked the beginning of a new kind of archaeology, one driven by faith and the search for physical relics. She moved through the Roman streets of Aelia with a focused, investigative intent, questioning local residents and consulting the ancient records to find the places where the foundations of the faith had been laid. Beneath the massive Temple of Venus, which Hadrian had built on a high platform to the northwest of the Old Forum, Helena believed the site of the Holy Sepulchre lay hidden. She ordered the systematic demolition of the pagan structure, a labor that involved hundreds of workers clearing away the marble statues and the heavy limestone blocks of the Roman shrine. As the earth was removed, a series of rock-cut tombs was revealed, carved into the very same Judean limestone that had formed the city's bedrock since the days of the Jebusites. The miniature of Helena standing before the open tomb, surrounded by the dust of the Roman demolition, captures the moment the city's identity was reclaimed from the classical world. It was a scene of quiet, reverent triumph, where the cold, dark interior of the cave became the most significant space in the newly Christianized empire. Clearing the rubble was only the first step in a monumental building program that would define the Byzantine era in Jerusalem. Constantine commissioned the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a vast complex that integrated the site of the crucifixion at Golgotha and the tomb of the resurrection into a single, grand architecture. The design was a blend of the Roman basilica and the martyrium, a circular structure known as the rotunda that centered on the tomb itself. The sound of the city in these years was once again the clinking of the mason's tools, but the work was now performed to honor a memory rather than to secure a garrison. Inside the rotunda, the atmosphere was defined by a heavy, reverent stillness that was quite different from the busy commerce of the Roman Forum. The light filtered down from a high, open dome, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors and the silver-sheathed shrine of the tomb. The human-scale detail of this space was the persistent, sweet scent of beeswax candles and the aromatic haze of frankincense that drifted through the arches. To stand within the church was to feel the weight of a world that had turned its gaze inward, toward the mysteries of the spirit, while the external world was governed by the order of the Byzantine state. The coldness of the stone was softened by the warmth of the flickering flames, a sensory contrast that defined the pilgrim's experience. Byzantine Jerusalem grew into a city of churches, monasteries, and hospices, all designed to accommodate the rising tide of travelers from across the empire. The Cardo Maximus, the great colonnaded street of the Roman period, now served as the primary artery for processions and pilgrims, its smooth stones worn even smoother by the passage of thousands of sandals. The city's markets shifted their focus to the needs of these visitors, offering small jars of holy oil, pilgrim flasks made of lead, and intricate wood carvings. The economy was no longer based on the needs of a military garrison, but on the logistics of faith and the circulation of sacred objects. One might observe that the city's topography was being rewritten to reflect the narrative of the scriptures. Sites like the Mount of Olives and the Pool of Siloam were adorned with new buildings, each one marking a specific moment in the life of the faith. To walk through the city in the 5th century was to navigate a landscape where the physical stone served as a mnemonic device for the sacred story. The historian notes that this was a period of intense intellectual activity as well, with scholars like Jerome and Cyril of Jerusalem working within the city's scriptoria to translate texts and refine the liturgy. The Ridge had become a library of stone and parchment, a center of literacy that rivaled the great cities of the East. Living in the city during the Byzantine era meant inhabiting a landscape that felt both ancient and newly consecrated. The houses of the residents were often built using the recycled stones of the Herodian and Roman periods, their walls a patchwork of the city's long history. The smell of the city was a mixture of wood smoke from the kitchens, the earthy scent of the Judean dust, and the constant floral undertone of the church incense. People lived in the shadow of the great church, their daily routines governed by the ringing of the bells and the cycles of the liturgical calendar. It was a time of settled religious routine where the city functioned as a living icon of the heavenly Jerusalem. Administrative control remained in the hands of the Byzantine governors and the local bishops, who managed the city's affairs with a focus on order and the protection of the holy sites. The wealth of the empire flowed into the city through imperial grants and the donations of wealthy pilgrims, allowing for the construction of even grander monuments. Under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, the Nea Church, the new church of the Theotokos, was built on the southern part of the ridge, a structure so massive that its foundations required the building of enormous vaulted substructures to support the weight. This church was a rival to the Holy Sepulchre in its scale, a testament to the continued imperial interest in the city's architectural glory. Warmth returns to the chronicle when we consider the everyday lives of the pilgrims who traveled for months to reach the gates. They came from the forests of Gaul, the plains of Anatolia, and the banks of the Nile, bringing with them a diversity of languages and customs. In the hospices, they shared meals of bread, olives, and wine. Their conversations a murmur of different dialects united by a common destination. The city was a crossroads of the human experience, a place where the vastness of the empire was compressed into the narrow alleys and the crowded church courts. A quiet observer might have noticed that for many of these travelers, the city was not just a place of stone and mortar, but the realization of a lifelong longing. Evidence of this era's physical reality can be seen in the Madaba map, a 6th century mosaic floor found in a church in modern-day Jordan. This map provides a detailed bird's-eye view of Jerusalem, showing the walls, the gates, the colonnaded streets, and the great church of the Holy Sepulchre with a vivid cartographic accuracy. It reveals a city that was densely built and highly organized, its architecture a reflection of the Byzantine ideal of beauty and order. The mosaic itself, with its thousands of tiny colored stones, is a metaphor for the city, a complex image built from a multitude of small individual parts. Interpretation of the city's role during this period suggests that it had become a holy city in a way that was entirely new. It was no longer just a national capital or a regional temple state. It was a universal symbol that belonged to the entire Christian world. The ridge had been transformed into a stage where the sacred past was continuously reenacted through ritual and pilgrimage. Yet, even in this era of Christian triumph, the ancient foundations remained. The Temple Mount, which the Byzantines largely left in a state of ruin as a sign of the old order's passing, sat as a silent, stony witness to the layers of history that had preceded the cross. Finally, as the 7th century opened, the quiet stability of the Byzantine era began to be challenged by new forces from the east. The Persian Empire under Khosrow II launched a devastating invasion that resulted in the capture of the city in 614 and the temporary loss of the True Cross. Though the Byzantines under Heraclius eventually reclaimed the city and restored the relics, the conflict left the region exhausted and its defenses weakened. The era of the cross and the stone was reaching its late afternoon, and the long shadows of a new power were beginning to stretch across the desert sands. Time moved toward a moment of profound transition as the sounds of the Byzantine liturgy were met by the rising energy of the Arab tribes. The ridge, which had seen the rise and fall of so many empires, was about to be integrated into a new, expanding world that would bring its own architecture and its own language to the Judean hills. The cross remained, but it was soon to be joined by the crescent, and the era of the Covenant of Omar was about to begin. Chapter 10: The Covenant of the Desert. Omar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph of the burgeoning Islamic State, did not arrive before the limestone walls of Jerusalem with the thunder of a traditional conqueror. In the year 638, the city stood as a weary sentinel of the Byzantine world, its defenses weakened by decades of conflict with the Sassanid Persians. The Arab forces had already secured the surrounding plains and the coastal cities, yet they waited for their leader to arrive from Medina to finalize the surrender. This delay was a matter of administrative protocol and religious gravity, reflecting the unique status the ridge held in the minds of the desert people. The sound of the city during these weeks was the low, persistent murmur of a population awaiting the inevitable shift of the world's axis. Sophronius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, watched the eastern horizon from the battlements, a man whose life had been dedicated to the preservation of the Byzantine order and the sanctity of the holy sites. He was a learned scholar and a defender of the faith, yet he was also a pragmatist who understood that the imperial center in Constantinople could offer no further rescue. His primary concern was the protection of the people and the churches from the chaos that often followed the fall of a capital. When he received word that the caliph had arrived, he prepared to meet him not with the weapons of war, but with the legalities of a dignified transfer. The air was cool and still as the gates were finally unbarred, marking the end of 5 centuries of Roman and Byzantine rule. Wearing the heavy, embroidered vestments of his office, the Patriarch stood at the gates in a posture of formal resignation. He saw a man approaching on foot, leading a camel upon which his servant sat, a sight that reportedly caused the sophisticated Byzantine leader a moment of profound confusion. Omar was dressed in a simple, patched tunic of coarse wool, a stark contrast to the silken robes and golden ornaments of the Roman officials. This meeting at the gates was a collision of 2 vastly different philosophies of power: the intricate, established hierarchy of the Mediterranean and the austere, direct clarity of the Arabian desert. The silence that fell between them was a pause in the march of history, a quiet recognition of the new reality that had arrived on the ridge. Walking through the narrow Roman streets, Omar was given a tour of the city's most significant sites by Sophronius, who acted as both guide and host. They moved through the colonnaded cardo, their footsteps echoing against the smooth paving stones that had been laid down in the time of Hadrian. The Caliph showed a keen interest in the city's topography and its history, asking detailed questions about the foundations and the builders of the various structures. To the local residents watching from their windows, the sight of the Patriarch and the Caliph walking together was a sign that the transition would be one of negotiated order. This tour was a symbolic claiming of the city, a peaceful mapping of the new administration onto the ancient stone. The Covenant of Omar, the legal document signed between the two leaders, provided a framework for coexistence that would define the city's character for centuries. It guaranteed the safety of the Christian population, their property, and their churches in exchange for the payment of a poll tax and the recognition of Islamic sovereignty. This document was an act of administrative foresight, ensuring that the city remained a functioning society even as its political orientation changed. It allowed the sounds of the bells to continue ringing and the pilgrims to continue their journeys to the Holy Sepulchre. The human-scale reality of the covenant was the continued presence of the Christian shopkeeper and the Byzantine priest within the walls, their lives protected by the word of the new ruler. A specific moment of restraint occurred when the Caliph and the Patriarch reached the Church of the Holy Sepulchre during the hour of the midday prayer. Sophronius invited the Caliph to pray within the sanctuary beneath the grand Byzantine dome, but Omar declined, stepping instead to the open ground outside the church entrance. He explained that if he were to pray inside, future generations of his followers might use the act as a justification to convert the church into a mosque, thereby violating the terms of the peace. This gesture of legal and religious discipline preserved the most sacred site of the Christian world, a decision that has resonated through the city's history for over a millennium. The Mosque of Omar was later built on the spot where he prayed, a modest neighbor to the Great Rotunda. Eventually, the tour led the leaders toward the Temple Mount, the vast limestone plateau that had been the center of the first and second houses. Since the time of the Roman destruction in 70 and throughout the Byzantine era, the site had been left in a state of intentional desolation, utilized as a repository for the city's refuse. Omar was visibly moved by the condition of the mountain, which he recognized as the site of the Masjid Al-Aqsa, the farthest mosque mentioned in the Quran. He immediately set about the work of clearing the debris, moving the baskets of dirt and ash with his own hands alongside his soldiers. This was the moment the ridge regained its focus, as the mountain was purified and reclaimed for a new era of worship. Purification of the mount required more than just the removal of physical waste. It involved a sensory cleansing of the site using the most precious substances of the time. The workers utilized water from the Gihon spring and large quantities of musk and camphor to scent the air and the stone, the floral and earthy aromas mingling with the cool breeze of the Judean hills. This olfactory transformation signaled that the mountain was once again a sacred space, a sanctuary that had been restored to its primordial dignity. The sound of the city in these weeks was the rhythmic scraping of shovels and the splashing of water, a labor of devotion that turned the ruin back into a monument. A simple wooden structure was erected on the southern edge of the platform to serve as the first Islamic house of prayer in the city. Persisting with this focus on the mountain, the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan later commissioned the construction of a permanent masterpiece that would crown the ridge. The Dome of the Rock, completed in the late 7th century, was designed to anchor the Islamic presence in Jerusalem with an architectural language that spoke to the entire Mediterranean world. It was an octagonal structure built with a mathematical precision that mirrored the proportions of the Holy Sepulchre, a deliberate dialogue in stone between the two faiths. The builders used Byzantine-trained craftsmen to create the intricate mosaics of gold and glass that decorated the interior, depicting lush vines and celestial patterns. The dome itself was a mountain of gold and blue, reflecting the light of the sun in a way that could be seen from the distant hills of Moab. Inside the dome, The atmosphere was defined by a heavy, resonant stillness that centered on the natural limestone of the foundation stone. This was the raw bedrock of the ridge, left unhewn and exposed within the refined geometry of the building. The light filtered through 36 windows at the base of the dome, casting a soft, amber glow across the mosaics and the ancient rock. The human-scale detail was the cool temperature of the air within the thick stone walls and the absolute silence that seemed to gather around the central rock. This was a space designed for contemplation rather than liturgy, a site where the earthly and the divine were believed to meet in a state of quiet equilibrium. Managing the city during the Umayyad period required a sophisticated administrative apparatus that integrated the local populations into the larger caliphate. Jerusalem served as a vital center of governance and religious scholarship, drawing thinkers and administrators from across the growing empire. The wealth of the state allowed for the construction of grand palaces to the south of the Temple Mount, their heavy limestone walls and intricate carvings reflecting a lifestyle of both strength and refinement. The city was a humming machine of trade and bureaucracy, where the records were kept in Arabic, but the rhythms of the day were still influenced by the ancient cycles of the harvest and the moon. To live in Jerusalem in the 8th century was to be part of a vibrant, cosmopolitan world that felt both new and deeply anchored in the past. Blue tiles, though a later addition to the dome's exterior, became the visual signature of the city's Islamic identity, their color echoing the deep clarity of the Judean sky. To walk through the city gates in the early morning was to see the first light catching the azure and turquoise surfaces, standing out against the pale grey of the surrounding walls. The scent of the city was a mixture of wood smoke from the bakeries, the iron-rich dust of the hills, and the subtle fragrance of the incense used in the sanctuary. It was a sensory world of intense contrasts, where the starkness of the desert met the complexity of the city. The human-scale reality was the steady movement of the pilgrims and the local residents, their lives woven together by the requirements of the law and the shared use of the ridge's resources. Quiet intelligence guided the Umayyad rulers as they sought to make Jerusalem a rival to the cities of the Hijaz and the Roman East. They invested in infrastructure, including the maintenance of the ancient aqueducts and the building of new reservoirs to ensure the city's water supply remained secure. This attention to the functional life of the city allowed it to grow in population and influence, becoming a central pillar of the Islamic world. The historian observes that this era was a golden age of architectural and administrative synthesis, a time when the city reached a new peak of beauty and order. The ridge was no longer a provincial outpost, it was a global center that commanded the attention of the entire world. Eventually, the shift of the Caliphate's center from Damascus to Baghdad under the Abbasids brought a slow cooling of the city's political status. Jerusalem remained a site of intense religious devotion, but it was no longer the primary focus of imperial ambition. The city settled into a more provincial role, a place of study and pilgrimage where the records were maintained by local scholars and the liturgy was conducted with a patient, unhurried regularity. This long interval of the 8th and 9th centuries was characterized by a quiet stability as the city's various communities learned to live within the framework of the Islamic State. The sounds of the city were the murmur of the study halls and the low-energy movement of the temple service, a steady pulse that remained unchanged for generations. One might observe that the city's physical fabric was becoming a dense accumulation of these various eras, with the Umayyad stone sitting directly upon the Roman and Herodian foundations. The walls of the houses were often built using the fragments of earlier buildings, creating a patchwork of history that was visible in every alley. The human-scale detail of this period was the texture of the Jerusalem limestone, which grew smoother and paler with age, reflecting the light of the sun in a way that made the city feel like a natural extension of the hills. Life was a matter of seasonal rhythms and religious observances, a long period of gathering strength before the next great shift in the world's power. As the 10th century approached, The quiet peace of the early Islamic centuries began to be challenged by the rise of the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt and the shifting fortunes of the regional powers. The ridge, which had seen so many empires rise and fall, was about to become the site of a new and more complex struggle. The era of the Covenant of the Desert had provided a foundation of order and coexistence, but the horizon was beginning to darken with the first signs of the coming Crusades. The city remained steady, its limestone walls holding the weight of the many stories that had been written upon them, waiting for the next turn of the wheel. Chapter 11: The Caliphate of the East and the South. Between the fertile alluvial plains of Mesopotamia and the emerald delta of the Nile, the Judean ridge sat as a silent inland pivot during the long centuries that followed the Umayyad decline. As the political center of the Islamic world shifted eastward to the newly built round city of Baghdad in 750, the administrative weight of Jerusalem underwent a subtle but persistent cooling. The city was no longer the primary canvas for imperial self-assertion, yet its spiritual gravity remained unmoving, drawing a different kind of energy to its limestone gates. It transitioned from a site of dynastic display into a vast, quiet sanctuary of scholarship and internal reflection. This was a place where the records were kept by men of the book rather than men of the sword. Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid caliphs, felt like a distant planet to the residents of the ridge, its bureaucracy conducted in a language of complex courtly intrigue and Persian-influenced administration. While the Umayyads had treated Jerusalem as a neighbor to Damascus, the Abbasids viewed it as a revered but remote province, a site to be maintained through pious endowments rather than monumental expansion. This distance allowed the city to cultivate a localized, resilient character, where the authority of the scholars and the heads of the religious communities carried more weight than the decrees of a faraway palace. The sound of the city during this era was the low-energy murmur of the study circles in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where students from across the East gathered to hear the traditions recited in the cool shade of the arcades. Under the shadow of this Eastern Caliphate, the city's economy settled into a reliable seasonal rhythm dictated by the arrival of pilgrims and the cycles of the olive harvest. The wealth of the ridge was not found in silver mines or silk looms, but in the liquid gold of the olive oil that was stored in massive subterranean cisterns carved into the rock. To live in Jerusalem in the 9th century was to be part of a society that valued the permanence of the resource over the volatility of trade. The human-scale reality was the thick, fruity scent of the pressing season and the sight of the heavy stone wheels turning in the dim light of the workshops. This was a process of extraction that had remained unchanged since the time of the first house. Power in the 10th century shifted once more, this time toward the south, as the Fatimid Caliphate rose in North Africa and eventually seized control of Egypt and the Levant. This was a transformation that brought a more immediate, though often more turbulent presence to the Judean hills. The Fatimids, who claimed descent from the Prophet's daughter, viewed Jerusalem as a vital ideological outpost against their rivals in Baghdad. They invested in the city's fortifications and its religious infrastructure, yet their reign was marked by the complexities of governing a diverse population from a center in Cairo. The atmosphere in the city grew more intense, a place where the different currents of the Islamic world met and occasionally collided within the narrow streets. Earthquakes in the middle of the 11th century provided a stark physical reminder of the mountain's own restless geology. In the year 1033, a series of tremors shook the ridge with a violence that caused the city walls to crumble and the domes of the great sanctuaries to fracture. This was a moment of profound administrative crisis, as the Fatimid authorities had to organize the labor and materials necessary to restore the city's skyline while facing threats from the surrounding tribes. The reconstruction was a labor of years, a patient fitting of new stone into old gaps that required the expertise of masons from across the Mediterranean. One might observe that the city's history is a recurring story of this kind of repair, a constant, quiet labor that keeps the ridge from returning to the dust. Rebuilding the walls after the Great Earthquake was a project that redefined the city's perimeter for the late medieval era. The Fatimid governors narrowed the circuit of the walls, leaving the southern part of the Ophel Ridge and the city of David outside the defenses to focus on the more densely populated areas. This decision effectively shaped the old city that is recognizable today, a compact, fortified heartland that felt more defensible and more urban. The sound of the city was once again the clinking of the tools and the calls of the foreman, a rhythmic progress of recovery that turned the ruins back into a stronghold. It was during this period of restoration that the city's character as a dense, inward-looking sanctuary was fully solidified. Nasir Khusraw, a Persian traveler and scholar, arrived at the gates of Jerusalem in the spring of 1047, carrying with him a keen eye for detail and a desire to document the physical reality of the holy city. He found a place that was built entirely of stone, noting with a scholar's precision that there were no mud bricks or timber frames to be seen in the houses. His description of the city is a miniature of the 11th century ridge, a landscape of clean, well-paved streets and bustling markets that existed in a state of high organization. He spent his days measuring the dimensions of the Haram al-Sharif with a long cord, recording the height of the arches and the number of steps in the stairways. This miniature of a man quietly measuring the mountain captures the era's fascination with the city as a physical manifestation of a sacred geometry. Market life, as recorded by Khusraw, was a sensory world of intense specialization and quiet industry. He describes a city where each trade had its own dedicated street, from the cotton beaters whose rhythmic thudding filled the air to the blacksmiths whose forges glowed in the shadows of the vaulted alleys. The sounds of the market were a layered tapestry of human effort, a low-energy movement of trade that felt both ancient and vital. People navigated the narrow passages with a practiced ease, their sandals wearing smooth the limestone paving that had been laid down centuries before. The city was a machine of commerce and consumption, its markets filled with the produce of the surrounding hills and the luxuries brought by the pilgrims from the coast. Particular attention was paid to the production of Jerusalem paper, a material that was famous throughout the Islamic world for its durability and its smooth, pale texture. The workshops utilized the abundant water from the local springs and the recycled fibers of linen and cotton to create sheets that were prized by scribes and administrators. To handle a piece of this paper was to feel the weight of the city's intellectual culture, a physical medium for the preservation of the law and the records. The sound of the paper mills, a soft and persistent splashing of water and the thud of the pulping hammers, provided a soundtrack for the city's administrative heart. This was a material detail that defined the city's role as a center of literacy and record-keeping, a place where the word was captured with the same care as the stone. Olive oil remained the city's primary surplus, a resource so abundant that Nasir Khusraw noted its cost was lower than almost anywhere else in the East. It was used for cooking, for medicine, and for the thousands of lamps that illuminated the sanctuaries and the private homes. The smell of the city at night was the subtle, earthy scent of burning oil, a thousands-year-old aroma that connected the Fatimid city to the era of the First Temple. In the markets, the oil was traded in large, heavy jars of fired clay, their surfaces often stamped with the marks of the producers. This was a human-scale reality of weight and measure, a physical economy that anchored the city to the landscape of the Judean hills. The intellectual atmosphere of the 11th century city was one of deep competitive study, as different schools of thought vied for influence within the mosque courtyards. Scholars from as far as Andalusia and Transoxiana arrived to participate in the debates, bringing with them a diversity of dialects and perspectives. They sat in the shade of the pillars, their voices a low murmur that blended with the sound of the wind through the arcades. The city acted as a vast, open-air library, where the knowledge of the ancient world was being integrated into the developing Islamic tradition. An interpretive aside from the chronicler suggests that this period was the city's intellectual peak, a time when it functioned as a genuine crossroads of the mind. Rhythm in the city changed abruptly in the late 11th century with the arrival of the Seljuk Turks, a nomadic power from the Central Asian steppes that had embraced Islam and sought to dominate the caliphate. They brought with them a more rigid military form of administration that replaced the more fluid Fatimid order. The Seljuks viewed Jerusalem as a strategic prize, and their arrival introduced a new level of tension to the region. They hardened the city's defenses and imposed stricter controls on the movement of people and goods, a shift that was felt immediately by the local residents and the visiting pilgrims. The sound of the city was now the clank of Turkish iron and the more frequent drills of the garrison on the northern plateau. Closing of the pilgrim routes from Europe, a consequence of the Seljuk expansion and the resulting instability in the Levant, became the final catalyst for the events that would reshape the ridge once again. For centuries, the Western pilgrims had been a consistent, if modest, presence in the city. But the new political reality made their journeys increasingly perilous. This disruption was felt in the markets and the hospices, where the absence of the travelers meant a loss of income and a break in the city's connection to the wider world. The atmosphere grew heavy with the sense of a coming storm, as the rumors of a great mobilization in the west began to drift toward the gates. The ridge remained steady, but the peace of the desert and the south was about to be met by the iron of the north. Sunset over the 11th century city revealed a landscape of intense density and layers, a place where the Umayyad domes and the Byzantine churches sat amidst the reconstructed Fatimid walls. The pale limestone reflected the fading light, turning the city into a city of silver and gold before the shadows took over the valleys. People gathered on their roofs to catch the evening breeze, looking out over the mountains that had protected them for so long. There was a quiet resilience to the city on the eve of the First Crusade, a sense that it had survived earthquakes and shifts of empire and would survive whatever was coming next. The administrative records were packed away, the lamps were lit, and the gates were barred against the night. Eventually, the sound of the trumpets from the hills would announce the arrival of the Frankish horizon. The long centuries of the Islamic Caliphate's quiet administration had come to a close, and the ridge was about to be integrated into a new and more violent world. The story of Jerusalem was about to turn toward the era of the Latin Kingdom, a time when the crosses would once again rise over the domes. The stone foundations held the weight of the past and the anticipation of the future, a patient bedrock for the unfolding drama of the second millennium. Chapter 12: The Frankish Horizon. In the month of June in the year 1099, the vanguard of the First Crusade finally crested the northern ridge of the Judean hills. After a 3-year journey across the vast Anatolian plateau and the rugged coast of the Levant, the knights and pilgrims from the west stood upon the height they called Montjoie, looking down for the first time at the limestone walls of their destination. The sight was one of intense, sun-drenched density, where the domes of the Islamic city sat nestled within the high fortifications that the Fatimid governors had recently repaired. For the arrivals from the forests of Gaul and the Rhineland, the city appeared as a terrestrial reflection of a celestial promise, a sight of stone and light that demanded their total devotion. The atmosphere on the ridge was one of exhausted, reverent silence, a pause before the final collision between the forces of the West and the defenders of the East. The siege that followed was a contest of engineering and desperate persistence, as the Crusader army lacked the numbers for a prolonged blockade and the local landscape lacked the timber necessary for siege machinery. Because the Fatimids had poisoned the wells outside the walls and cleared the surrounding hills of trees, the Frankish knights were forced to haul logs from the distant forests of Samaria and the coastal plains. They labored under the relentless heat of the Judean summer, their heavy iron tools clinking against the wood as they constructed two massive siege towers. The sound of the city during these weeks was the rhythmic, muffled thud of the catapults and the cries of the defenders from the battlements, a low-energy prelude to the eventual breach. Once the towers were completed and moved against the northern and southern walls, the assault began in the early morning light of the 15th of July. Godfrey of Bouillon and his brother Baldwin led the breach at the northern wall, where the topography offered a slight advantage for their heavy wooden structures. The conquest was a violent, chaotic breaking of the city's Islamic seal, a moment of transition that saw the streets filled with the sounds of iron and the cries of the dispossessed. The historian notes that this victory was followed by a systematic clearing of the city's population, an act of supreme symbolic and physical violence that left the ridge in a state of stunned, hollowed silence. The city that had been a vibrant center of three faiths was suddenly transformed into a singular Latin fortress. Within the walls of the newly captured capital, the atmosphere shifted from the shock of battle to the unhurried necessity of administrative organization. Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen as the first leader of the new state, though he refused the title of king out of a pious desire not to wear a crown of gold where his predecessor had worn a crown of thorns. He styled himself instead as the protector of the Holy Sepulchre, a title that prioritized the city's religious status over its political utility. He set about the task of establishing a government that could manage a territory surrounded by hostile neighbors, his administration a blend of military discipline and feudal obligation. The sound of the city returned to the steady, unhurried pacing of the Frankish guards on the battlements and the murmur of the Latin liturgy in the reclaimed sanctuaries. Baldwin of Bouillon succeeded his brother a year later and chose a more formal path toward the establishment of a sovereign state. He understood that the survival of the Latin presence depended on a visible, established monarchy that could command the respect of the European houses and the local nobility. In the year 1100, on the Feast of Christmas, he traveled south to Bethlehem to be formally crowned in the Church of the Nativity. The light of the winter sun filtered through the high windows of the ancient Byzantine basilica, reflecting off the king's polished armor and the silk banners of his knights. This coronation was a quiet, measured event that signaled the permanence of the new order, a moment where a knight of the north became a king of the east. Construction of the royal palace on the Temple Mount followed the establishment of the monarchy, as the Crusaders sought to anchor their power in the city's most significant topography. They took over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which they called the Temple of Solomon, and converted its vast prayer halls into a royal residence and a stable for their horses. To the south of the dome, they created a series of secluded courtyards and gardens, planting citrus trees and fragrant herbs that reminded them of the Mediterranean coast. This human-scale detail, the smell of lemon blossoms mingling with the dry dust of the limestone, created a sensory environment that was both exotic and familiar. The palace was a fortress of luxury, where the administrative records were kept in Latin and the rhythms of the court were governed by the feudal code of the West. Feudalism, a system of land and loyalty born in the damp, fertile plains of Europe, was now mapped onto the arid, rocky landscape of the Judean hills. The kingdom was divided into fiefs and lordships, each held by a knight who owed military service and administrative counsel to the king in Jerusalem. This was an era of intense, localized bureaucracy, where every village and every olive grove was accounted for in the royal ledgers. The city functioned as the nerve center for this network, a place where the High Court met to settle disputes, and the treasury was maintained by the knights of the military orders. To live in Jerusalem in the 12th century was to be part of a sophisticated, if precarious, machine of state that relied on the constant circulation of men and resources from the West. To live as a Frankish knight within the walls was to inhabit a body permanently weighed down by the weight of iron and the requirements of defense. The chainmail, a mesh of thousands of interlocking rings, was a heavy second skin that the knights wore even in the midday heat, its metallic scent a constant companion in the dry air. When they walked through the narrow streets, the rhythmic clinking of their armor provided a persistent soundtrack to the city's life. They sought the cool shade of the vaulted alleys, their boots wearing smooth the paving stones that had been laid centuries before by the Romans. The human-scale reality of the Latin kingdom was one of physical endurance and the persistent, quiet strain of maintaining a Western lifestyle in a desert environment. Romanesque architecture began to alter the city's skyline as the Crusaders sought to express their faith in the sturdy, enduring style of their homelands. They built new churches with thick limestone walls, narrow windows, and heavy, rounded arches that provided a sense of security and permanence. These structures did not seek the airy height of the Byzantine churches, but rather a solid, defensive beauty that felt like an extension of the city's own fortifications. The sound of the city was now the ringing of the heavy bells from the new campaniles, a sound that carried across the Kidron Valley and into the hills where the shepherds watched their flocks. Jerusalem was becoming a city of the West, its aesthetics and its language rooted in the feudal world of Europe. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre underwent its most significant transformation during this period, as the Crusaders sought to unify the disparate Byzantine shrines into a single, grand cathedral. They built a massive new transept and choir, crowning the site with a dark stone dome that created an interior of immense, echoing stillness. Inside the church, the atmosphere was defined by the scent of beeswax and the smoke of the oil lamps that burned perpetually before the tomb. To stand in the center of the nave was to feel the weight of a world that had moved across oceans and mountains to claim this specific spot of earth. The miniature of the master mason carving the delicate foliage of the capitals shows the care with which the Crusaders sought to beautify their most sacred space, a labor of devotion that has endured for centuries. Institutional power within the walls was increasingly shared between the monarchy and the military orders of the temple and the hospital. The Knights Templar, established to protect pilgrims on the road to the city, became the kingdom's most formidable soldiers and its most efficient administrators. They built their headquarters on the Temple Mount, utilizing the subterranean vaults of Herod's platform for their stables and their storehouses. The sound of the mount was the neighing of the war horses and the rhythmic thud of the blacksmith's hammer, a military energy that existed alongside the quiet of the sanctuary. The Templars were a state within a state, their white mantles with the red cross a common sight in the city's markets and courts. One might observe that the Latin kingdom was a period of intense cultural and material synthesis, despite the violent nature of its founding. The Frankish lords began to adopt the clothing and the food of the East, finding that the light linens and the citrus-rich diet were better suited to the climate than the heavy wools of the north. They utilized the services of local Syrian and Greek physicians whose knowledge of medicine and botany far surpassed that of the Western practitioners. The city became a crossroads of encounter, where the Crusader knight and the Eastern merchant negotiated the terms of a shared life in the shade of the colonnades. This was a quiet, functional integration that occurred beneath the surface of the grand political and religious struggles. Administrative records from the mid-12th century show a city that was densely built and highly organized, with specific districts dedicated to the different nationalities of the settlers. The Genoese, the Pisans, and the Venetians each had their own quarters, where they managed their own trade and maintained their own laws. The markets were once again filled with the goods of the wider world, from the spices of the East to the fine cloths of Flanders. The sound of the city was a tapestry of different languages, French, German, Italian, and Latin, mingling with the local Arabic and Syriac. Jerusalem was a cosmopolitan capital of a feudal empire, its walls protecting a society that felt itself to be at the center of the world. As the 12th century progressed, The confidence of the Latin kingdom began to be tested by the rising unity of the Islamic powers in the surrounding territories. The internal politics of the Crusader court, marked by the struggles between the local lords and the newly arrived knights, created a fragility that the massive walls could not entirely hide. The sound of the city was now more frequently the sounding of the alarm and the hurried movement of the garrison to the gates. The atmosphere grew heavy with the sense of an approaching storm as the news of a unified force under the Sultan Saladin began to drift toward the ridge. The Latin era was reaching its late afternoon, and the long shadows of a new power were beginning to stretch across the Judean hills. Time in the city moved with a patient, unhurried wait as the Crusaders prepared for the inevitable confrontation. They strengthened the walls, filled the cisterns, and gathered the relics of the saints into the safety of the churches. To walk the ramparts in those days was to see the hills of Moab and the desert of Judah, with an eye for the movement of armies and the glint of the crescent banners. The ridge remained steady, its limestone foundations holding the weight of the Romanesque stone and the iron of the knights, a patient bedrock for the next shift in the world's power. The history of Jerusalem was once again approaching a point of profound transition, a moment when the cross and the crescent would meet at the gates. Chapter 13. The Rosewater Restoration. Fragrance often carries the memory of a city more effectively than the heavy weight of its masonry. In the autumn of 1187, the air within the limestone walls of Jerusalem underwent a profound olfactory shift as the sharp, metallic tang of iron and the scent of wood smoke gave way to the overwhelming sweetness of roses. This was the moment of the Ayyubid Restoration, a transition of power that was as much a sensory reclamation as it was a political one. After nearly a century of Latin rule, the city was returned to the Islamic sphere by Saladin, the Sultan known to the West as Saladin. The sound of the city during these weeks was the rhythmic splashing of water and the low murmur of workers clearing away the symbols of the Frankish horizon, a patient labor of purification that sought to restore the sanctuary to its earlier dignity. Saladin was a ruler whose administrative style favored the deliberate and the negotiated over the purely kinetic. Following his victory at the Horns of Hattin, where the military strength of the Latin kingdom was effectively broken, he approached Jerusalem with a methodical patience. He understood that the city was a site of universal significance, and he sought a surrender that would preserve its structures and its people. The siege was a brief, focused affair of position and parley, culminating in a treaty that allowed the Christian population to ransom themselves and depart in peace. This was an act of strategic mercy that ensured the transition was one of order rather than chaos, a moment where the legalities of the desert met the requirements of the ridge. Entering the city on the anniversary of the Prophet's night journey, the Sultan directed his immediate attention to the Haram al-Sharif. For 88 years, the Dome of the Rock had served as a church, and its natural limestone surface had been covered by a marble altar and a choir of singing monks. Saladin ordered the removal of these additions, but he insisted that the stone itself be treated with a particular reverence. Hundreds of baskets filled with rosewater, distilled from the vast gardens of Damascus, were brought up the mountain to be poured over the floors and the walls of the sanctuary. The human-scale detail of this labor was the sight of the water cascading over the ancient rock, the floral steam rising in the cool morning air to fill the octagonal chamber with the scent of a Syrian spring. Inside the dome, the miniature of this purification captures the Sultan himself participating in the work, his own hands helping to scrub the limestone. This was a symbolic act of humility and reclamation, a physical gesture that sought to erase the memories of the Latin occupation through the medium of water and fragrance. The sound within the dome was the soft, persistent splashing and the echoes of the workers' voices as they removed the gold-leafed crosses and the statues that had adorned the space. As the rosewater settled into the pores of the stone, the building was once again consecrated as a site of Islamic worship. The atmosphere was one of quiet, aromatic triumph, where the raw bedrock was finally returned to the open air. Material changes to the city's skyline followed the purification, as the Ayyubid builders sought to reinforce the Islamic identity of the ridge while maintaining its defensive strength. They dismantled the Grand Crusader altar in the Holy Sepulchre and walled up the Golden Gate to prevent any future incursions from the east. However, unlike the earlier conquests, this was not a destruction of the city's past, but a selective editing of its symbols. Saladin allowed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to remain open to Eastern Christian pilgrims, recognizing that the city's status as a global sanctuary required a degree of pragmatic coexistence. The sound of the city bells was replaced by the call to prayer, yet the diversity of the population remained a visible, if quieter, reality. Institutional stability was provided through the establishment of new religious endowments, or waqfs, which funded the maintenance of the mosques and the construction of new colleges. The Sultan converted the Latin Patriarch's palace into a Sufi convent and established a grand hospital in the district of the Muristan, utilizing the expertise of local physicians. These institutions were the administrative anchors of the Ayyubid city, providing social services and education to a population that was once again growing in density. The records of these endowments, kept in the elegant, flowing scripts of the Ayyubid chancery, show a meticulous attention to the logistics of charity and the preservation of the sacred sites. To live in Jerusalem in the late 12th century was to be part of a society that was being reorganized around the principles of Islamic law and the Sultan's personal vision of piety. Particular care was taken to protect the Jewish community, which had been almost entirely excluded during the Crusader era. Saladin issued an invitation for the Jewish families of the Maghreb and the East to return to the city, recognizing their ancient connection to the ridge. This brought a renewed energy to the markets and the study halls, as the sounds of different prayers and dialects once again layered upon one another in the narrow streets. The city was returning to its role as a crossroads of the three faiths, a place where the requirements of the state were balanced by the sensitivities of the sanctuary. The historian observes that this was a period of restorative justice, a time when the city's fragmented identity was being woven back into a single complex tapestry. Rhythm in the city changed again in the early 13th century as the Ayyubid dynasty grappled with the continued pressure from the west and the internal rivalries of the Sultan's successors. In 1229, a remarkable and controversial diplomatic event occurred that briefly returned the city to Latin control. Sultan Al-Kamil of Egypt, facing a complex political landscape, signed the Treaty of Jaffa with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. This agreement ceded Jerusalem to the Christians for a period of 10 years, with the critical exception of the Temple Mount, which was to remain under Islamic jurisdiction. This was a victory of the pen over the sword, a quiet, administrative partition of the ridge that satisfied neither the zealots of the West nor those of the East. Frederick II, a man of profound intellectual curiosity who spoke Arabic and admired the culture of the Levant, arrived in the city to claim his prize with a modest retinue. He entered the Holy Sepulchre and placed the crown upon his own head, as no priest would perform the ceremony for an excommunicated emperor. During his brief stay, he visited the Temple Mount, where he engaged in philosophical discussions with the Islamic scholars and expressed his admiration for the beauty of the dome. The human-scale detail of this era was the sight of the emperor walking through the streets without a guard, a monarch of the West who felt at home in the atmosphere of the East. This was a moment of surreal equilibrium, a decade where the city functioned as a shared space under a tenuous, negotiated peace. Negotiation, however, proved to be a fragile foundation for the city's long-term security. The Treaty of Jaffa was met with outrage in both Rome and Cairo, and when the 10-year period expired, the city once again became a target for the shifting regional powers. The walls, which had been partially dismantled by the Ayyubids to prevent the city from being held by a rival, left the population vulnerable to the next wave of invaders. The sound of the city in these years was the noise of the wind through the gaps in the fortifications, a reminder of the instability that followed the loss of a strong central administration. Jerusalem was a city in flux, its status determined by treaties signed in distant camps rather than by the strength of its own gates. A final, violent transition occurred in 1244, when the Khwarezmian clans, displaced by the Mongol expansion in the east, swept through the Judean hills. They captured the city with a sudden, devastating kinetic force that ended the era of the Latin treaties and the Ayyubid negotiations. The Holy Sepulchre was looted, and the population was once again scattered, leaving the ridge in a state of desolation that mirrored the fall of the first and second houses. This was the moment the city's medieval fragility was laid bare, a realization that the ridge required a more robust and permanent defender to survive the storms of the 13th century. The era of the Rosewater Restoration was ending, and the era of the Mamluk sword was about to begin. Time in the late Ayyubid city moved with the frantic pace of a society that knew its peace was temporary. People lived with their possessions packed, their eyes always turned toward the horizons for the dust of approaching armies. The scent of the roses had faded, replaced once again by the smell of wood smoke and the dust of the crumbling walls. Yet, the work that Saladin had begun, the restoration of the Islamic character of the mountain, remained the enduring legacy of the era. The Dome of the Rock stood steady, its blue tiles and golden dome a constant presence, regardless of who held the keys to the gates. Warmth returns to the chronicle when we consider the persistence of the local residents who refused to leave the ridge during these turbulent decades. They were the true custodians of the city, the families who maintained the shops, the cisterns, and the shrines, while the kings and sultans argued over the treaties. They were the ones who understood that the city's true life resided in the seasonal rhythms of the Judean hills and the steady pulse of the spring. The interpretive aside of the historian is that the city's survival was predicated on this local resilience, a quiet strength that underpinned the grand dramas of the Crusades and the Caliphates. Eventually, the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, led by the fierce and efficient military caste of the north, would bring the stability that the ridge so desperately needed. They would rebuild the walls, expand the sanctuaries, and turn Jerusalem into a jewel of their empire. The sounds of the city would once again be the sounds of the mason's tools and the chants of the scholars, a new era of architectural and administrative grandeur. The ridge was waiting for the next layer of its history to be written in the red and white stones of the Mamluk architects. Chapter 14. The Architecture of the Sword. The institution of the religious endowment, or the Waqf, became the primary engine of Jerusalem's physical and social recovery as the 13th century drew to its close. Under the Mamluk Sultanate, a military caste of former slave soldiers based in Cairo, the city was reimagined as a prestigious center of Islamic learning rather than a mere strategic fortress. These rulers channeled the vast wealth of their empire into the establishment of madrasas, hospices, and Sufi convents that clustered around the Temple Mount like jewels set in a limestone crown. To walk through the city in this era was to see a capital being built through the legal permanence of the endowment, a system that ensured the buildings remained maintained and the scholars were fed through the proceeds of distant lands. The administrative weight of these records provided a steady, bureaucratic pulse that underpinned the city's quiet growth, turning the ridge into a sanctuary of academic and spiritual density. Stability returned to the ridge under the firm hand of Sultan Baybars, who recognized that the security of the holy city was essential to the legitimacy of his reign. He directed the repair of the fortifications and the renovation of the Dome of the Rock, ensuring that the scars of the earlier centuries were healed with the precision of Mamluk masonry. The city began to expand northward and westward, its new residential districts defined by a sophistication that reflected the peak of the Sultanate's power. This was a period of intense construction, yet the work proceeded with a patient, unhurried gait, as if the builders knew they were creating an architecture that would outlast the sword. The sound of the city was the low murmur of the construction sites and the steady, rhythmic pacing of the Mamluk administrators as they walked the perimeter of the Haram. Aesthetic choices in the Mamluk city were defined by the striking use of black, a style characterized by alternating courses of red and white limestone. This visual rhythm turned the entrances of the madrasas into grand polychromatic gateways that commanded the attention of every passerby. The red stone, often brought from the quarries of the south, sat in perfect, seamless alignment with the local white limestone, creating a sensory world of contrast and order. To stand before the facade of a Mamluk building was to feel the weight of an empire that valued the beauty of the geometry as much as the strength of the stone. The human-scale detail of this era was the smooth, polished texture of these stones, cool to the touch even in the height of the summer afternoon, their surfaces reflecting the soft light of the Judean sun. Madrasas, or colleges of law and theology, became the defining architectural unit of the city, with over 60 such institutions established during the Mamluk period. These buildings were designed with central courtyards and deep, vaulted halls where the students sat in silence to hear the lectures of the master scholars. The architecture was intended to facilitate the study of the word, providing a sheltered, quiet environment that was separate from the noise of the market. The scent of these madrasas was a mixture of old parchment, damp stone, and the subtle fragrance of the oil used in the lamps. Life for the students was governed by the cycles of the prayer and the rigorous requirements of the curriculum, a culture of the book that flourished within the red and white walls. Particular attention was paid to the needs of the pilgrims and the poor through the establishment of ribbats or hospices that offered shelter and food to the weary traveler. The sound of the city in these districts was the gentle, persistent splashing of water from the fountains in the courtyards, a sound that provided a constant soundtrack to the life of the hospice. These fountains, or siebels, were often integrated into the walls of the buildings, their limestone basins filled with cool water from the ancient aqueducts that the Mamluks had painstakingly restored. The human-scale reality of the ribbat was the smell of lentil soup being prepared in the communal kitchen and the sight of the rows of simple mats laid out for the guests. This was a city that cared for the stranger, its administrative energy directed toward the logistics of hospitality and the preservation of the sanctuary's dignity. Tanqiz al-Nasiri, the powerful governor of Damascus in the early 14th century, commissioned one of the city's most magnificent structures, the Tanqiziyya Madrasa, overlooking the western wall of the Haram. He sought out the finest architects and craftsmen of the empire to create a building that would serve as both a school and a monument to his own piety. The construction was a labor of years, requiring the careful carving of the limestone into the complex, stalactite shapes known as muqarnas. The architect of the Tanqiziyya sat in the shade of the rising walls, his eyes fixed on the drawings that mapped the intricate geometry of the vaulting. This was a moment where the mathematical mind of the East was translated into the physical permanence of the ridge, a bridge between the abstract and the tangible. Carving the muqarnas involved a degree of precision that felt almost like a form of meditation for the master masons. Each individual cell of the stalactite vaulting was carved from a single block of limestone, designed to fit together in a complex three-dimensional puzzle that appeared to defy gravity. The sound of the workshop was the rhythmic, soft clinking of the small iron chisels against the stone, a sound that echoed through the narrow streets of the market. The miniature of this architect, his fingers stained with the fine white dust of the quarry, captures the exact moment when the raw material of the hills was turned into a celestial architecture. He worked with a patient, unhurried focus, knowing that a single error in the calculation would collapse the entire harmony of the gateway. When the Tankizia was completed in 1328, it stood as a masterpiece of the Mamluk style, its red and white entrance a grand portal into a world of study and prayer. The governor himself arrived to inspect the work, his administrative eye noting the quality of the masonry and the depth of the carvings. The building provided the city with a new center of intellectual gravity, a site where the highest legal scholars of the age gathered to debate the finer points of the law. The sound of the madrasa was the murmur of these debates, a low-energy movement of the mind that matched the steady pulse of the city. The Tankizia remains today a silent anchor of the Western Wall, its muqarnas still catching the shadows of the afternoon sun. Administrative oversight of the Haram al-Sharif reached a high level of sophistication during the Mamluk era, with a dedicated staff of officials responsible for every aspect of the sanctuary's maintenance. They managed the cleaning of the courtyards, the repair of the mosaics, and the distribution of the olive oil used in the thousands of lamps. The records of the Haram, kept in the archives of the Nazir, or the overseer, show a meticulous attention to the provenance and quality of every material used. This was a bureaucracy of the sacred, where the work of the hands was seen as a form of worship. The sound of the mount was the soft rustle of the scrolls as the administrators recorded the tithes and the endowments that supported the city's life. Beyond the temple precincts, the city's residential districts thrived under the stability of the Mamluk peace, with new houses built to accommodate the rising population. These dwellings often featured interior courtyards and flat roofs where the families gathered in the evening to catch the Judean breeze. The human-scale reality of this era was the seasonal rhythm of the markets, where the produce of the hills was traded for the silks and spices of the east. The smell of the city was a mixture of wood smoke, baking bread, and the iron-rich dust of the hills, a sensory world that felt both established and enduring. Jerusalem was a city of stone and scholarship, its walls protecting a society that valued the quiet of the study hall as much as the activity of the bazaar. Interpretive asides from the historian suggest that the Mamluk period was the era when Jerusalem's aesthetic identity was most fully crystallized. The use of ablaq, the intricate muqarnas, and the grand gateways created a visual language that spoke of an empire that was both powerful and deeply pious. The city became a magnet for the retired elite of the Mamluk court, who built their own tombs and madrasas within the walls as a way of securing their legacy. This created a city of monuments, a landscape where every turn in the narrow alleys revealed a new work of stone and art. The ridge was a library of the Sultanate's ambition, a place where the history of the era was written in the red and white limestone. Comparison of the Mamluk style to the Gothic architecture of the West reveals a shared interest in the play of light and the complexity of the vaulting, though expressed through different geometries. While the Gothic builders sought the verticality of the spire, the Mamluks focused on the intricate density of the dome and the portal. The human-scale detail of this comparison is the weight of the stone, which in both cultures was used to create a sense of the eternal and the sacred. To walk through a Mamluk madrasa was to feel a similar reverence to walking through a European cathedral, a feeling of insignificance before the scale of the vision. The city was a bridge between the different architectural traditions of the world, a site where the masonry was the primary medium of the human spirit. Growth of the city's northern and western boundaries occurred as the Mamluks established new quarters for the various religious and ethnic communities. The Jewish quarter, which had been revitalized under Saladin, continued to flourish as a center of study and commerce, its population finding a steady equilibrium under the Mamluk administration. The sounds of the different prayers once again layered upon one another, a low-energy harmony that reflected the city's status as a global sanctuary. The administration managed these communities through a system of local autonomy, ensuring that each group could follow its own laws while contributing to the overall order of the city. The human-scale reality was the shared use of the city's resources, from the waters of the Siloam to the markets of the Cardo. Eventually, the cooling of the Mamluk power toward the end of the 15th century brought a slow decay to the city's infrastructure. The grand madrasas and hospices began to show the weight of their years, and the administrative machine in Cairo was distracted by internal strife and the arrival of new threats from the north. The sounds of the city were now more frequently the noise of the wind through the gaps in the masonry and the quiet concerns of the elders. The era of the Mamluk sword was reaching its late afternoon, and the long shadows of the Ottoman Empire were beginning to stretch toward the ridge. The history of Jerusalem was once again approaching a point of profound transition, a moment when the red and white stone would be met by the blue tiles of the Sultan. Chapter 15. The Walls of the Sultan. As a direct result of the Mamluk collapse in Egypt, the administrative keys of Jerusalem were handed over to the Ottoman Sultan Selim I in the winter of 1517. This transition was a quiet, almost clerical affair, lacking the catastrophic violence that had marked the city's previous changes of hand. The local scholars and elders recognized the shifting of the regional wind and chose to welcome the northern power as a means of ensuring the continuity of their traditions. Selim entered the city through the northern gate, dismounting to show respect for the sanctuary and confirming the ancient privileges of the city's residents. This peaceful succession meant that the physical fabric of the ridge remained untouched by the engines of war, preserving the Mamluk stone for the layer of history that was about to be laid over it. Ottoman bureaucracy brought a new level of meticulous record-keeping to the Judean hills. The Tari surveys were initiated, documenting every household, olive tree, and water source within the city's jurisdiction with a cold, fiscal precision. These registers, written in the complex Ottoman Turkish script, reflect a state that viewed the city as a prized asset to be managed through orderly taxation and legal oversight. To live in Jerusalem during this early Ottoman era was to be part of a vast imperial machine that stretched from the Danube to the Nile. The sound of the city was the scratching of the quill in the governor's palace, as the new administration settled into the rhythms of the Judean year. Suleiman the Magnificent, succeeding his father, found himself haunted by a recurring vision that would eventually reshape the city's silhouette. In the depth of the night, while resting in his palace in Istanbul, he dreamt he was walking alone through the hills of Judea when two fierce lions emerged from the shadows to devour him. The animals, according to the legend, were a manifestation of divine displeasure, sent because the Sultan had left the holy city in a state of ruin and neglect. He awoke with a start, the heavy scent of incense and old parchment in his room feeling like a call to action. This private, dream-born anxiety became the public catalyst for the reconstruction of the walls, a project intended to appease the lions and secure the Sultan's place in the city's long history. Resource mobilization for this monumental task began in 1537, drawing on the wealth and labor of the entire empire. Suleiman dispatched architects from the school of the Great Sinan and allocated the revenues of Egypt to fund the massive quantities of limestone and lime needed for the mortar. Thousands of local masons and laborers were gathered, their hands once again finding the familiar grain of the Judean limestone. The city became a vast workshop, its air filled with the fine white dust of the quarry and the rhythmic, persistent clinking of the chisels. This was the largest building project the city had seen since the time of Herod, a labor of years that proceeded with a patient, imperial unhurriedness. The new walls followed the ancient lines of the ridge, utilizing the massive ashlar blocks of the Herodian and Roman periods as their foundation. By recycling these older stones, the Ottoman builders ensured that the new fortifications were anchored in the very bedrock of the city's history. The texture of the walls was a patchwork of eras, where the smooth Herodian borders sat beside the rougher Crusader masonry and the crisp, newly carved Ottoman blocks. This was a city being re-enclosed, a physical act of definition that turned the sprawling medieval settlement back into a fortified stronghold. To walk the perimeter of the rising walls was to see the city's identity being unified within a single cohesive frame. Architectural focus was given to the 7 primary gates, each designed to serve as a functional portal and a statement of imperial power. The Damascus Gate, situated on the northern side where the terrain was most level, became the grandest of these entrances, featuring ornate battlements and intricate stone carvings. It was a site of constant administrative activity, where the caravans from the north were inspected and the taxes were collected by the Sultan's officials. The human-scale detail of the gate was the cool, deep shade of its vaulted interior, a space where the travelers could find a moment of rest from the heat of the Judean sun. The sound of the gate was the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves and the low murmur of the merchants negotiating their passage. St. Stephen's Gate, later known to the local population as the Lion's Gate, serves as the most visible anchor of the Sultan's legendary mandate. Carved into the limestone above the portal are 2 pairs of lions, their stylized forms standing in a posture of quiet, unmoving vigilance. These carvings were likely repurposed from an earlier Mamluk building, yet their placement here was a deliberate nod to the dream that had initiated the work. The human-scale detail of the lions, their weathered surfaces, and the simple, bold lines of their heraldry provides a sensory bridge between the Ottoman present and the Mamluk past. As the afternoon sun catches the pale stone, the lions seem to glow with a soft, reflected warmth, a small, grounded image of protection that has watched over the eastern approach for 500 years. Restoration of the Haram al-Sharif proceeded alongside the construction of the walls, as Sulayman sought to beautify the city's most sacred plateau. He ordered the replacement of the weathered Byzantine mosaics on the exterior of the Dome of the Rock, with vibrant, intricate tiles from the imperial kilns of Iznik. These tiles featured floral motifs and sprawling calligraphic inscriptions in shades of turquoise, cobalt, and white, creating a visual rhythm that felt both celestial and ordered. To see the dome in this era was to witness a transformation of light, as the tiles caught the glare of the sun and turned the sanctuary into a brilliant jewel. The scent of the city near the sanctuary changed slightly, as the glazed ceramic surfaces did not hold the dust of the hills as the porous limestone did. Beneath the blue tiles, the administrative life of the sanctuary was governed by a hierarchy of officials who ensured the sanctity of the site. They managed the endowments that paid for the olive oil in the thousands of lamps and the maintenance of the complex water systems that fed the fountains. The records of the Haram from the 16th century show a meticulous attention to the provenance of every material used, from the lead for the roof to the silk for the inner curtains. This was a bureaucracy of the sacred, where the work of the hands was seen as a form of worship and a testament to the Sultan's piety. The sound of the mount was the soft rustle of the scrolls as the administrators recorded the tithes that supported the city's religious life. Water management remained a primary concern for the Ottoman administration, leading to the restoration of the ancient aqueducts and the building of new public fountains, or sabils. These fountains were often small, elegant structures of carved stone, placed at strategic points throughout the city to provide free water to the thirsty. One such sabil, built near the chain gate, featured an elaborate arch and a basin that was always filled with the cool flow from the hills of Bethlehem. The sound of the city in these districts was the gentle, persistent splashing of the water, a sound that provided a constant soundtrack to the life of the market. This was a functional benevolence that anchored the Sultan's authority in the daily comfort of his subjects. One might observe that the walls of Suleiman created a psychological as well as a physical boundary, marking the beginning of a 400-year period known as the Pax Ottomana. Within these walls, the city's various religious and ethnic communities lived under a system of relative autonomy known as the millet system. Each group was allowed to manage its own internal affairs and follow its own laws, provided they remained loyal to the Sultan and paid their taxes. This administrative structure allowed for a long period of quiet stability, where the tensions of the past were moderated by the requirements of the imperial order. The city was a dense, complex mosaic of different faiths, their lives woven together by the shared use of the ridge's resources. Living in the city during the 17th and 18th centuries meant inhabiting a landscape of settled, unhurried routine. The houses were built closely together, their thick limestone walls providing a natural insulation against the extremes of the Judean climate. In the evening, families would gather on their flat roofs to catch the breeze and watch the sunset over the mountains of Moab. The smell of the city was a mixture of wood smoke, baking bread, and the iron-rich dust of the hills, a sensory world that felt both established and enduring. Jerusalem was no longer a site of constant conflict, but a provincial center of pilgrimage and study where the past was respected and the future felt predictable. Interpretation of the city's role during this era suggests that it functioned as a living museum of its own history, its Ottoman walls preserving the layers of the Roman, Byzantine, and Mamluk eras within. The city did not seek to expand beyond its fortifications, remaining a compact, stony heartland that looked inward toward its sanctuaries. This was a period of gathering memory, where the traditions of the different faiths were solidified and the records of the families were maintained with a sense of ancestral pride. The asides of context suggest that for the people of this era, the city was a place of rest, a site where the noise of the world was muffled by the thickness of the masonry. Eventually, the cooling of the Ottoman power toward the end of the 19th century would bring the first tremors of the modern era to the gates. The rise of European interest and the arrival of the first steam engines and telegraph lines would slowly break the long quiet of the Pax Ottomana. But for most of these 4 centuries, the ridge remained a place of deep, unmoving stability, its silhouette defined by the walls that Suleiman had built in response to a dream. The history of Jerusalem was once again approaching a threshold, but the Ottoman layer had provided a foundation of stone and order that would endure well into the next century. Chapter 16: The Modern Threshold. General Allenby's approach to the city in the final month of 1917 was marked by a deliberate, unhurried restraint that mirrored the gravity of the landscape he was entering. The Ottoman administration, which had governed the ridge with a patient, bureaucratic weight for 4 centuries, had finally withdrawn in the face of the advancing British forces. The city sat in a state of expectant stillness, its limestone walls glowing with the pale gold of the winter sun as the era of the sultans drew toward its quiet conclusion. Allenby, a man who understood the symbolic power of the geography, chose to forgo the traditional triumph of a conqueror, opting instead for a gesture of humility that would resonate through the city's many layers of history. This transition was not a sudden breaking of the past, but a formal, measured opening of a new chapter in the ridge's long narrative. Within the late 19th century city, the first tremors of modernization had already begun to alter the rhythms of the Judean hills. The long quiet of the 17th and 18th centuries had been met by a rising global interest as the European powers established a permanent and visible presence within the walls. Consulates, hospices, and schools were built by the French, the Russians, the Germans, and the British, each adding a new architectural dialect to the city's limestone vocabulary. This was a period of intense, quiet expansion, where the administrative map of the city was being redrawn to include the interests of a modern, industrializing world. The sound of the city was now a mixture of the ancient bells and the first distant whistles of the steam engines that were approaching from the coast. European consulates functioned as semi-autonomous enclaves within the Ottoman framework, their flags flying over heavy iron gates and their courtyards filled with the languages of a dozen nations. This brought a new, cosmopolitan energy to the narrow streets, as the traditional markets were joined by shops offering the goods and the news of the West. The human-scale detail of this era was the sight of the first telegraph lines being strung across the rooftops, their thin black wires cutting through the clear Judean air. People watched with a mixture of curiosity and caution as the city was physically linked to the global network of information, a shift that made the distance between Jerusalem and London feel smaller with every passing year. The smell of the city changed slightly as well, as coal smoke from the new boilers mingled with the earthy scent of the dust. Outside the Jaffa Gate, the city began to spill over its Ottoman boundaries for the first time in centuries. Mishkenot Sha'ananim, the first Jewish residential district built outside the walls, was established in the 1860s, a collection of low stone buildings with red-tiled roofs that looked out over the Hinnom Valley. This move was a physical breaking of the city's defensive seal, a sign that the security provided by the walls was no longer the only factor in the city's growth. New neighborhoods sprouted in the stony fields, their gardens and wide streets offering a different kind of urban life than the dense, vaulted interior of the old city. The ridge was becoming a binary landscape, a place where the ancient heart remained steady while the modern limbs expanded into the hills. The arrival of the railway from Jaffa in 1892 was a material transformation that brought the pace of the industrial world directly to the city's edge. The journey from the coast, which had once taken days on horseback or by carriage, was now reduced to a few hours of steady, mechanical progress through the mountain passes. The sound of the city was now punctuated by the rhythmic chugging of the locomotive and the clatter of the iron wheels on the rails, a sensory intrusion that signaled the end of the city's isolation. To live in Jerusalem at the turn of the century was to inhabit a place where the ancient seasonal rhythms were increasingly met by the clockwork regularity of the modern state. The human-scale reality was the weight of the coal in the tenders and the smell of the steam in the cool morning air. Ottoman administrative control, though fraying under the pressures of the modern world, remained a steady, predictable presence until the outbreak of the Great War. The governors managed the city through a complex system of local councils and imperial decrees, ensuring that the diverse communities continued to coexist within the shared space of the ridge. Records from this late period show a meticulous attention to the logistics of public health, education, and the maintenance of the sacred sites. The sound of the city was the murmur of the students in the new modern schools and the steady pacing of the Ottoman gendarmes in their woolen uniforms. It was a time of gathering tension, as the city's residents watched the clouds of the global conflict darken the horizon. War in the early 20th century brought a period of profound deprivation and administrative strain to the city's gates. As the Ottoman Empire aligned itself with the Central Powers, Jerusalem found itself isolated once more, its supply lines cut and its young men gathered into the imperial armies. Famine and disease returned to the narrow streets, a quiet, devastating presence that stripped away the layers of modern progress. The human-scale detail was the weight of the meager bread rations and the sight of the empty markets where trade had once flourished. To walk through the city in 1916 was to feel the weight of a world that was being ground down by the machinery of total war. The 11th of December in 1917 provided the final, quiet pivot for the city's Ottoman history. As the Turkish forces withdrew toward the north, the British army reached the heights surrounding the city, and a formal surrender was prepared by the local mayor. The atmosphere was one of intense, exhausted relief, a sense that the long centuries of the Sultanate were ending and a new, unknown era was beginning. General Allenby approached the Jaffa Gate under a sky that was clear and cold, the limestone of the walls reflecting the soft winter light. He moved toward the entrance, not on a horse, but on his own 2 feet, a decision that has become the defining image of the modern threshold. Allenby dismounted at the entrance to the Jaffa Gate, leaving his horse with his officers to enter the city as a simple traveler. He walked through the high, arched portal, his boots making a steady, rhythmic sound against the ancient paving stones that had been worn smooth by 4 centuries of Ottoman feet. This miniature of a commander walking through the gate, surrounded by a small retinue and the silent residents of the city, represents the moment the ridge transitioned into the 20th century. It was a gesture of respect toward the sanctity of the site and a rejection of the kinetic violence that had marked so many previous conquests. The sound of the city was the low-energy movement of the crowd and the distant, muffled clopping of the horses waiting outside the walls. Proclamations were read in several languages from the steps of the David's Tower, assuring the inhabitants that their holy sites would be protected and their traditions respected under the new British administration. This was a moment of intense administrative clarity, a formal resetting of the city's legal and social order. The records of the Ottoman governor were packed away, replaced by the files of the British Mandate, a shift that brought the English language and the English mind to the governance of the Ridge. The city was now a part of a global empire that stretched across the oceans, its future tied to the decisions made in the halls of London. Yet, as the ceremony ended and the crowds dispersed, the limestone walls remained unchanged, holding the memories of all the rulers who had come and gone. The city did not immediately change its character with the arrival of the new administration. It settled back into its limestone identity with a patient, unhurried resilience. The sound of the bells and the call to prayer continued to layer upon one another, a low-energy harmony that transcended the political shifts of the day. People returned to their daily routines, gathering water from the fountains and baking their bread in the communal ovens. The human-scale reality of the city was the same as it had always been, a matter of stone, water, and the steady passage of time. Jerusalem was a city of deep memory, and the British layer, like the Ottoman and the Roman layers before it, would eventually become part of the mountain's enduring story. Limestone remains the primary witness to the city's long narrative, its pale surface absorbing the heat of the sun and releasing it into the cool air of the evening. To touch the walls of Suleiman is to feel the weight of the centuries and the patient labor of the thousands of masons who have shaped this ridge. The city is a palimpsest of human ambition and religious devotion, a place where the past is never truly gone but is always present in the texture of the stone. We move backward from the modern events of the 20th century toward the broader, quieter perspective of the hills that have watched over this ridge since the time of the first house. The history of Jerusalem is not a finished book, but a continued state of being, a physical presence that persists regardless of the passage of time. As the sun sets over the Judean hills, the long shadows of the minarets and the steeples stretch across the city, marking the beginning of a quiet rest. The light of the Golden Dome catches the final rays, standing out against the deepening blue of the sky before the darkness takes over the valleys. The sound of the city, once a cacophony of engines and voices, is now a low, distant murmur that blends with the rustle of the olive trees in the Kidron. The air is still and cool, carrying the faint scent of the earth and the cooling stone, a sensory rest that signals the end of our journey through the layers of the ridge. One feels the weight of the long millennia settling like dust upon the landscape, a patient accumulation of history that requires nothing from the observer. The city has reached a point of repose, its stories woven into a tapestry that is too vast to be fully untangled. We move away from the names and the dates, toward the broader silence of the mountains and the steady, unmoving presence of the Gihon Spring. The history of Jerusalem is the history of the mountain itself, a landscape of deep memory that persists through the rising and setting of 1,000 empires. The Gihon Spring continues to pulse in its hidden cave, its cool, clear water flowing through the dark channels of the rock just as it did in the days of David and Hezekiah. This water is the constant heartbeat of the city, a life-giving force that remains unchanged by the events occurring above ground. To listen to the soft splashing of the water is to hear the most ancient sound of the ridge, a rhythmic reassurance of the city's endurance. The mountain holds the water and the stone, a patient bedrock for the unfolding drama of the human spirit. Shadows grow long and soft in the narrow alleys, and the lamps are lit in the houses and the sanctuaries, their flickering flames reflecting off the polished limestone. The city is a place of rest, a site where the noise of the world is muffled by the thickness of the masonry and the depth of the tradition. We let the chronicle trail off here, in the company of the lions at the gate and the silence of the temple courts. The ridge remains steady, its limestone foundations holding the weight of the crosses, the domes, and the crescent, waiting for the next chapter in its long, patient history. The ridge is a landscape of peace, its pale stone a canvas for the light of the moon and the stars. The valleys are deep and dark, their ancient ravines holding the memories of the sieges and the celebrations of the past. We move further back into the quiet of the Judean wilderness, where the wind carries the scent of the dry earth and the promise of the morning. The city of Jerusalem is a silent anchor in a world of change, a place where the eternal and the temporal meet in the stillness of the night. The journey is complete. Rest well.